The morning Hector Grimes rode up to their fence, he didn't even bother getting off his horse. He just looked down at Martha, all of her, top to bottom, and laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not the kind a man swallows quick because he knows better. The kind that comes up from the belly, mean and slow, meant to be heard by everyone standing within earshot. He pointed at the 342 baby chicks peeping and stumbling around in the dust behind her and said, loud enough for the whole settlement to turn and look, "Lord Almighty, Caleb, your wife spent your last dollar on dinner." The men standing by the grain store laughed. A few women looked away. Caleb's jaw went tight. Martha didn't move. She stood there in the heat with her hands at her sides, feeling every single eye on her body, on the chicks, on the $18 that was supposed to save them, and now felt like the stupidest thing a person had ever done. She didn't cry. She almost did, but she didn't. What she did instead would change everything. If this is your first time here, don't leave yet, because what happens next is the kind of story you'll be thinking about for days. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss one of these. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to 1887, to the Dakota Territory, to a woman nobody believed in, and find out what she was really made of. The summer of 1887 came in like a fist. By the middle of June, the soil in the lower Dakota Territory had cracked into plates the color of old bone, and the wind that moved across it picked up grit and pushed it against every surface, against the sod walls, against the window glass that was already so thin you could press a thumb to it and feel the heat on the other side, against the skin of a person's face until the skin went raw and tight and everything felt like it needed to be somewhere else. Martha Mercer. She had been Martha Holloway before she married Caleb, and sometimes she still thought of herself that way, as the person she'd been before any of this, stood outside the sod house at 5 in the morning and looked at the sky and tried to figure out what she was feeling. It wasn't quite fear. It wasn't the specific dread of a woman who knew a disaster was coming. It was something quieter than that, something that lived just underneath the fear, patient and cold. She was 24 years old. She weighed more than any woman in the settlement, more than most of the men, and she had spent every year since she'd been old enough to understand other people's eyes, learning to stand in her own skin without flinching. She hadn't always managed it, but she'd gotten better. Living out here had done that for her, if nothing else. When your sod house is held together with mud and hope, and your nearest neighbor is 4 miles of open nothing away, you learn quick that nobody's coming to rescue you from anything, including yourself. Caleb was still inside. She could hear him moving around, that familiar early morning shuffle of a man who hadn't slept well and was trying not to wake anyone with the fact of it. Their daughter, Rose, not yet 2, all dark hair and opinions, was asleep on the narrow cot in the corner. Their savings, what was left of them after 2 seasons of bad yields and 1 dead mule, came to $18.40, which they kept in a tobacco tin on the shelf above the door. $18.40. In a good year, that wasn't enough to do much. In this year, after the late frost that had killed the first planting and the dry May that had killed the optimism of the second, it was the difference between getting through to autumn and not getting through at all. Caleb had a plan for the money. He'd had the plan for weeks, quiet and careful the way he was with everything, working it out in his head before he said a word about it out loud. Seed for a 3rd planting, if the summer could hold. A new harness for the neighbor's draft horse he'd been borrowing on credit. Maybe enough left over for a small plow blade to replace the one that had bent in the rock-hard June soil. It was a reasonable plan. Every person in the settlement, if you'd asked them, would have said it was the only reasonable plan. Martha stood outside in the gray morning and watched the grass. It wasn't moving the way grass moved in wind. The movement was wrong, too low to the ground, too specific, too rhythmic. She'd been watching it for 3 days, the way a person watches something they almost know what it is but can't quite bring themselves to say it out loud yet. She got down on one knee in the dirt, which cost her something these days, the knee that had been bad since the fall from the wagon 2 winters ago, and she put her hand flat against the ground and stayed still. They were there, thousands of them. Small enough to miss if you weren't looking, small enough to dismiss if you were the kind of person who needed to dismiss things to get through a hard season. Nymphs. Grasshopper nymphs, the color of the dead grass they were hidden in, climbing over each other in the dirt beneath the stems. Martha sat back on her heels and looked at the horizon and thought about her mother's farm in eastern Nebraska, 1874. She'd been 11 years old. She remembered the sound first, not an explosion, more like a change in the quality of the air, a thickening, a darkening, and then the crops her father had put in with everything he had were simply gone. In a morning, not quite a morning, faster than that. She stood up. Her knee complained. She ignored it. When she walked back inside, Caleb was pouring water into the kettle, and he looked at her face and set the kettle down. "What?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like a man bracing. "I need you to listen to me," Martha said. "I need you to really listen, not the way you listen when you're already thinking about what you're going to say next." "Martha, the grasshoppers are hatching." She watched his face. "In the lower field. They're everywhere. I've been seeing signs for 3 days and I didn't say anything because I wanted to be sure, and I'm sure." Caleb was quiet. He was a lean man, 30 years old, with a face that had been worn by weather until it looked 10 years older, and he had the particular stillness of a person who had learned not to let panic rise to the surface. It wasn't coldness, it was discipline. Martha had always loved that about him, and also sometimes found it maddening. "If they've already hatched," he said finally, the planting is finished. If we plant, we're feeding grasshoppers." He said nothing. She watched him absorb it, watched the careful plan he'd been building in his head quietly dismantle itself. "Then what?" he said. Martha had been working up to this moment for 3 days, ever since she'd first put her hand on the ground and felt the movement beneath the grass. She had run it forward and backward in her mind, turned it over, tested it against every objection she could think of, because she knew what it was going to sound like, and she knew who she was, and she knew how people in this settlement listened to her, or didn't. "Chicks," she said. "Baby chicks. We take the money and we buy every one we can get." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. "Chickens," Caleb said. "Not just chickens. A lot of chickens. Enough to put in the fields. Grasshopper nymphs can't fly yet. They're slow, they're ground level. A flock of chicks can clear ground faster than you'd believe. I watched it happen once, at the Garrett farm east of Hebron. Old Edna Garrett turned her chickens out ahead of a hatch, and she was the only farm in 10 miles that kept anything. That was one woman with a few chickens and a lot of luck. It was a woman who understood what she was seeing and acted on it." Caleb turned back to the kettle. He filled it from the water pail, set it on the stove, did all of it slowly, like a man who needed the time occupied while he thought. 300 chicks, Martha said, maybe more. If we move them in sections, keep them ahead of the worst of the hatch, cover the lower field first, and then bring them up. Martha, we have $18. I know what we have. 300 chicks at current prices. I talked to Dunmore last week. He has 342 available, day-olds, from 2 hatches. He'll take $15 for the lot. He needs the space for his summer layers. Another silence. Different in quality from the last one. This one had something calculating in it. You already talked to Dunmore. I needed to know if it was possible before I brought it to you. Caleb turned around. He looked at her for a long moment, and Martha held the look, which was something she'd had to practice. Not because Caleb was a hard man. He wasn't. He never had been. But because being looked at directly, being the subject of sustained attention, had never been easy for her. Not when she knew what people saw. If you're wrong, he said quietly. I know. If you're wrong, we've got no seed, no harness, no blade, and 300 chickens we can't afford to feed. I know, Caleb. We could lose the farm. We're going to lose it anyway if the swarm comes and we've put everything into seed. She held his eyes. You know that's true. You know it as well as I do. He looked at her for what felt like a long time. Then he looked at the tobacco tin on the shelf. 342 chicks, he said. 342. He picked up the tin, held it in both hands, set it back down, picked it up again. Okay, he said. It came out rough, like it had been sitting in his throat. Okay. They drove to Dunmore's that morning, both of them in the wagon, Rose wrapped and bundled between them, the tobacco tin in Martha's coat pocket. The road was 4 miles of rutted track that the dry season had made worse, and the wagon bounced and jolted, and Rose slept through all of it with the profound indifference of the very young. Martha didn't talk on the way out. She turned things over in her mind. The positioning of the pens, the timing of the moves, the water problem, which was going to be real and serious and needed solving before it became a crisis. She was aware, underneath all of it, of something that felt like terror. But she kept it in a separate room in her head, and she did not open that door. Dunmore's place smelled like every chicken farm. Warm feathers, dust, manure, the particular dense animal heat of a lot of birds in a small space. Dunmore himself was a heavy-set man in his 60s who wore the same suspenders Martha had seen him in every time she'd come out here. And he looked at her the way most men in this territory looked at her. Eyes moving, cataloging, arriving at a conclusion, then rearranging their face into something neutral. "Heard you might be coming," he said. His eyes moved to Caleb. "Thought it was a joke, honestly." "It's not a joke," Caleb said. Steady. Martha appreciated that about him. Dunmore looked at her again. "Day-olds, you know what the mortality is on day-olds, especially in this heat? You're going to lose half before they're big enough to do anything useful." "I know the mortality rates," Martha said. "What do you need 300 chicks for? You're not running a commercial operation out there." "I need them for the fields," she said. He blinked. He looked at Caleb. "For the fields?" "For the grasshoppers," Caleb said. Dunmore was quiet for a moment. Then a sound came out of him. Not quite a laugh, more than a breath. "Lord Almighty." He shook his head slowly. "Lord Almighty." He looked at Martha's body, looked away, looked back. "Your wife's suggestion, I take it." "It is," Caleb said, and his voice had changed, gone a degree flatter and harder, the change so small most people wouldn't catch it. Martha caught it. $15, you said, she told Dunmore. "That's what I said." She put the money on the counter. He counted it twice. Then he went out back to get the crates. They loaded 342 chicks into every crate, basket, and wooden box they'd brought, and a few that Dunmore provided, and they drove home with the wagon full of sound. 1,000 small voices all speaking at once in a language that had nothing to do with human worry or human doubt, just the pure and complicated business of being alive and brand new and needing things. Martha sat in the wagon with her hand resting on the slats of the nearest crate and felt the warmth rising from inside it, the tiny bodies pressing against the wood, and she thought, "You're the whole bet, every cent we had. You'd better be worth it." It was the moment the sky above the road darkened with moving shapes. Not grasshoppers, not yet, just starlings, a murmuration rippling through an evening sky. But something in Martha's chest tightened. She'd seen enough of the territory's moods to know that what was quiet today was not necessarily quiet tomorrow. The settlement saw them coming home. Of course it did. In a place this sparse, a loaded wagon on the main road was news before you even stopped rolling, and by the time Caleb pulled up to water the horse, 3 men from the grain store were standing at the fence watching. Hector Grimes was one of them. I was a tall man, the kind of tall that adds authority in situations where there is no good reason for authority, and he owned the largest section of land in the settlement and never let anyone forget it. He had an opinion about everything, delivered with the confidence of a man who had been agreed with enough times to stop questioning whether he was right. He looked at the wagon. He looked at the crates. He looked at the sound coming from the crates. Then he looked at Martha, all of her, the way he always did, slow and assessing and slightly contemptuous, and he said what he said. "Lord Almighty, Caleb, your wife spent your last dollar on dinner." The men laughed. One of the women watching from the store porch looked at her shoes. Martha stood by the wagon wheel and felt the heat of the afternoon and the heat of being looked at all at once. And she did not move, and she did not say anything, and she did not cry, which she almost did, which she would not let herself do in front of Hector Grimes if every feather of every one of those chicks depended on it. Caleb started to say something. Martha put her hand on his arm. "Let's get them home," she said quietly. They drove the rest of the way in the long prairie silence, the chicks talking underneath it. Rose awake now and watching the clouds with the gravity of a child who had just discovered there was sky. That night, after Rose was asleep and the chicks were settled into the temporary pen Caleb had thrown together from wagon boards and old canvas, Martha sat at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil and worked out the plan. All of it. The grid of the fields, the sequence of the moves, the water points, the timing. She wrote small and careful, the way she'd been taught by a teacher who believed handwriting was a form of thinking. Caleb sat across from her and watched and didn't say anything for a long time. "How long before the nymphs get wings?" he asked finally. 4 to 6 weeks, depending on heat. "And you think 4 to 6 weeks of the chicks working the fields? I think if we do it right, we can keep the lower field and the corn rows. Maybe the beans." She looked up. "I think it's the only chance we've got." He nodded, just once, the way Caleb nodded when he'd made peace with something. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound that was almost nothing, almost silence, but wasn't quite. Martha listened to it and thought about the movement she'd felt beneath her hand 3 days ago. Millions of small things waiting to become something enormous and catastrophic and unstoppable. Unless. She capped the pencil and folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket. Unless. In the morning, the real work would begin, and it would be harder than anything she'd planned for, because it always was out here, because the territory took what you thought you understood and showed you the 17 things you'd missed. She knew that. She'd always known that. She blew out the lamp and sat for a moment in the dark, listening to 342 small lives breathing in the pen outside. And she thought, I hear you. I hear every one of you. Don't die on me. Then she went to bed. The paper. Martha had folded into her apron pocket the night before was already soft at the creases by the time the sun came up, because she had taken it out 3 times between midnight and dawn to look at it in the dark, not reading exactly, more the way a person holds something they need to believe in. Morning came hard and bright, the way it always did out here. No gradual warming up, no gentle suggestion of light. Just the sun clearing the flat eastern line of the world and announcing itself like something that didn't care what you had planned. Martha was already outside. She'd been outside since before the sky changed color, crouched at the edge of the temporary pen, counting. She counted to the best she could. It was difficult. They moved constantly, 342 small bodies, pressing and tumbling and stepping on each other with the cheerful, mindless energy of creatures that had been alive less than 48 hours and had not yet developed any awareness of the concept of danger. She got to 200 and something and lost count and started again. And then Rose woke up inside and started crying, and Martha stood up with her knee complaining beneath her and went back in. Caleb was already up. He had Rose in one arm and was trying to figure out the fire with the other hand, which was not working. And he looked at Martha with the expression of a man who was handling 3 things and dropping 2 of them. I've got her, Martha said, taking Rose, who immediately grabbed Martha's braid and pulled with the specific determination of a child who had identified leverage. I counted 63 dead, Caleb said. He was looking at the fire now, not her. His voice was flat and careful. Martha had counted 61. The difference didn't matter. It's the heat. And the transport, a lot of them were already stressed when we bought them. Dunmore said we'd lose half. Dunmore says a lot of things. He might be right about this one. He might. Martha shifted Rose to her other hip. We'll know more in a week. The ones that are still alive this morning are probably the ones that are going to make it. Caleb turned around. 280 chicks, Martha. Maybe less. Is that enough? He looked at her. She looked back. I don't know, he said. You're the one who... I know I'm the one. I'm asking you. Is it enough? He was quiet for a moment. Then, we work with what we have. It wasn't an answer, but it was the only answer either of them had, so Martha filed it away, and they ate breakfast in the particular silence of 2 people who have already said the important things and are now saving their energy for the work. The work started the same morning, and it was nothing like Martha had drawn on paper. The idea on paper was clean. A grid, sections. The chicks moved in groups across the lower field, working ahead of the hatch, covering ground in an organized sequence that would let them eat the nymphs before the nymphs ate everything. On paper, the timing made sense, the sections were manageable, the pen system she'd sketched out was simple enough for 2 people to handle. Reality was a different animal entirely. The first problem was the pens. Martha's original design called for lightweight frames that could be dragged across the field in sections, keeping the chicks contained but mobile, covering new ground every few hours. But the lumber they had was what they had. Old wagon boards, a broken axle, the frame from a harness box that had collapsed last winter. And when Caleb put the first pen together at first light, it weighed 3 times what Martha had expected and moved like something that didn't want to be moved. It won't drag, Caleb said. He pushed at it. It rocked without shifting. Can we add runners? With what? Martha looked at what they had. Willow branches from the creek bottom. Old canvas from the wagon cover, stiff with disuse. A coil of wire that had been hanging in the barn since before they bought the place. She picked up the wire and turned it over in her hands and thought about it. I need an hour, she said. Martha, 1 hour. Keep them in the temporary pen. She spent the hour on the ground in the heat, bending wire, lashing willow to boards, figuring out by trial and error what worked and what didn't. She ruined 3 sections before she found the combination that held wire runners bent into shallow curves along the bottom edges of the frame, the canvas draped over the top and staked along the sides, light enough that one person could move it by pulling on a rope attached to the front corners. Not elegant. Nothing about it was elegant. One side always rode higher than the other. The canvas flapped when the wind came up and startled the chicks, but it moved. That was the thing that mattered. It moved. Caleb watched her test it across a section of yard and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "That might work." "I know it might work," Martha said. "That's why I built it." They built 4 more pens that morning, each one slightly different from the last as Martha refined things, adding a wire latch here, adjusting the runner angle there. Her hands were bleeding by midday from the wire ends, small cuts that kept reopening every time she bent another section. She wrapped them in strips of cloth and kept going. The chicks went into the pens in groups of 60, which was more than Martha wanted and fewer than the space strictly required, but it was the number that balanced feed consumption against coverage. She needed them hungry enough to chase nymphs aggressively, not so crowded that they stopped eating and started piling. Finding that balance was guesswork. Everything about this was guesswork dressed up as a plan. The lower field was where they started, because that was where Martha had first put her hand to the ground and felt the hatch beginning. She walked ahead of the first pen with a stick, turning over clumps of soil, reading the density of the nymphs, trying to understand how far the hatch had spread. It was worse than 3 days ago, measurably worse. The density in the thickest sections was enough that the ground seemed to move if you looked at it for too long, a kind of visual shimmer that wasn't heat and wasn't wind. When the first pen of chicks hit that section of field, the sound changed. Martha had expected them to eat. She hadn't expected how fast. 60 half-grown chicks encountering a field floor thick with nymphs moved with a focus she hadn't seen in chickens before. Not lazy barnyard scratching, but something more urgent, almost frantic, heads down and moving, the constant rapid motion of creatures that had found an abundant food source and were working it hard. Within 20 minutes, the section they'd been put on looked different, not clear, not clean, but visibly worked. The shimmer was less. She called to Caleb, who was setting up the second pen 30 yards away. "Come look at this." He came. He stood next to her and looked at the worked ground and at the chicks still moving through it. "Huh," he said. "Huh," Martha agreed. The word was doing a lot of work for both of them. It was standing in for, maybe this is actually going to function. Maybe she was right. Maybe the 63 dead chicks and the $18 and the way Hector Grimes had laughed were all going to mean something different than they'd looked like they meant. But then the second pen's canvas tore. It tore along the back corner seam where Martha hadn't had enough wire to double the binding. And before Caleb could get there, 30 chicks were out and scattered across 2 sections of field in every direction, not in an organized feeding pattern, but in the random, panicked scatter of small birds that have just discovered open space. They got 23 back. 7 had disappeared into the tall grass at the field's edge before Martha could reach them, and she stood at the grass margin and called and clicked and did everything she'd ever heard of and got nothing back. 7 chicks. She stood there a moment. Then she turned around and went to find more wire. The thing about the chicks that no plan had accounted for was their dying. They kept dying. Not in the dramatic mass casualty way of a disaster, just in the persistent, grinding, one here, one there way of creatures that were too young and too delicate for the environment they'd been placed in. The heat killed some. Predators got others. A red-tailed hawk discovered the operation on the 3rd day and helped himself every afternoon until Caleb strung a series of reflective tin pieces along the field edge that seemed, eventually, to discourage him. A water shortage nearly finished them on the 4th day. The water problem was the one Martha had flagged on her paper the first night and had not yet solved, and it arrived as a crisis on schedule. The creek at the south property edge was still running, barely, a narrow thread of brown water over cracked mud, and the barrel they'd been hauling from it ran dry by noon of day 4 with the afternoon still ahead. 60 chicks showing signs of heat stress in the second pen, listless and panting in ways that Martha recognized as early danger. She did not panic. She thought about it for approximately 90 seconds, which was as much time as the situation allowed. And then she told Caleb to take the wagon to the creek and fill every container they owned, including the ones they used for cooking and washing, and in the meantime she took their 2 ceramic cooking crocks and walked the half-mile to the creek herself, filled them both, carried one in each hand back across the field in the afternoon heat, which was a thing that should probably not be attempted by a woman of her build in that temperature with a bad knee. But the chicks didn't have opinions about what should and shouldn't be attempted, so she did it. Her face was the color of brick by the time she got back. Her dress was soaked through. She poured both crocks into the water trough in the second pen and stood there bent over her own knees breathing, and the chicks rushed the trough with the single-minded urgency of creatures that knew what they needed. "I'm putting in a pipe," she said when she could talk again. "From the creek. Gravity feed." Caleb, just returning with the wagon and the filled barrels, looked at her and then looked at the field and then looked at the distance between the creek and the pens. "That's a lot of pipe." "I know how much pipe it is. We don't have the money for—" "I know we don't have the money." She straightened up. Her knee was on fire. "I'm going to go talk to Willard at the hardware. He can take payment in eggs in the fall." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, "You think Willard's going to—" "I think Willard has been talking about his daughter's prospects for 2 years and has no idea how to think practically about the future. I think if I explain to him how many eggs 200 laying hens produce in a year, he'll see the value of the arrangement." Another silence. "You've already thought about what you're going to say to him." "I think about things," Martha said simply. "It's what I do." She went to see Willard the next morning. He was a small, careful man who kept his hardware organized with more precision than most people kept their finances. And he listened to Martha's proposal with his hands folded on the counter and his eyes moving now and then, the way eyes do when a person is running numbers. She gave him the egg production figures. She gave him the survival projections. She explained the pen system. She did not give him the chance to say no before she'd answered every objection she could anticipate. When she finished, Willard said, "Your husband sent you to ask this?" "I came myself," Martha said. "I see that." He unfolded his hands, looked at the counter. 30 feet of tin pipe in the joints. I'll need the first delivery by October. October. And it has to be your best layers. "You'll get what we have," Martha said. "Same as everyone." He looked at her for a moment, and she met the look. And whatever he saw in it seemed to settle the question, because he wrote up the credit ledger and turned it around for her to sign. The pipe went in on day 6, Caleb digging the shallow trench in the cracked earth, while Martha managed the pens. And by day 7, they had a gravity feed running from the creek to a central trough point that she could redirect with a movable elbow joint. It was ugly. The pipe sat half exposed along the trench because the soil was too hard to sink it properly. But water ran. That was the only metric that mattered. By day 8, the surviving chicks. She was down to 219 now, losses from heat and predation and the simple attrition of creatures that had been bought too young and transported too hard, were working the fields with an efficiency that Martha had not allowed herself to expect. The lower field showed measurable difference. The nymph density in the sections the chicks had covered was down to a level where the shimmer was gone. Bare patches of worked soil showed where the birds had been. You could track their path across the field like a kind of slow, living map. It was working. She didn't say that out loud. She didn't let herself think it without the qualifier that it was working so far, and working were not the same thing, and the nymphs hadn't gotten wings yet, and whatever the hatch was doing in the far sections of the field she hadn't reached yet, she couldn't account for. But she stood at the edge of the lower field on the morning of day 8 and looked at what 219 determined half-grown chicks had done to the ground she'd been most afraid of, and she let herself feel, for about 30 seconds, something that was close to hope. 30 seconds was enough. Then she went to move the pens. On day 9, Hector Grimes came by. He didn't knock. He never did. In Martha's experience, he was the kind of man who considered his own arrival sufficient announcement. He pulled up in his wagon and got down and walked to the fence that separated their property from the road, and he stood there with his arms crossed on the top rail looking at the fields. Martha was in the lower field, moving the second pen with the rope and pulley system she'd rigged on day 5, dragging it hand over hand across the section. She saw him and said nothing. He watched for a while, then, "Caleb around?" "He's at the creek, checking the pipe joint." "What pipe joint?" Martha explained the water system, briefly, without particular interest in his reaction. Grimes looked at the pipe, looked at the pens, looked at the chicks working the field. "How many you got left?" "Enough. Dunmore said you bought 300 and change." We did. You've lost near 100. We've lost some. I was quiet. Martha kept pulling the pen. The rope was rough, and her palms were still cut from the wirework, and pulling on the rope reopened the cuts every time, but she pulled anyway, because she was not going to stop working, because Hector Grimes was standing at her fence. You know, he said, even if this works, even if the chicks eat every nymph in your field, when the wing swarm comes through, they'll strip everything you've got left in 20 minutes. I know that. So you're spending all this. He waved a hand at the field, a gesture that managed to be dismissive and bewildered at the same time, just to delay it. I'm not trying to stop the swarm, Martha said. She stopped pulling and looked at him. I'm trying to make sure there's less for them to eat when they get here. And I'm growing a flock. Those aren't the same thing. Grimes looked at her. He had the specific expression of a man who has come intending to find something to feel superior about, and has found, instead, something he doesn't entirely understand. It wasn't a comfortable expression for him. The fat woman's farming plan, he said, and his voice had a quality that was not quite a sneer but was the raw material one is made from. Settlements talking about nothing else. Good, Martha said, and turned back to the rope. She heard him stand there for a moment. Then she heard him get back in his wagon. Then she heard the wagon move on. Caleb, when she told him that night, was quiet for longer than usual. Then, he's worried. I know he's worried. That's what that was. I know. Caleb looked at her across the table. His south field borders our east field. If the nymphs are as bad in his corn as they are in our lower section, they're worse, Martha said. His soil is lower and wetter from the spring runoff. Better conditions for hatching. I looked at it from the road last week. He doesn't know that. He suspects it. That's what the visit was. Caleb was quiet again. Rose was asleep. The lamp was low. Outside, somewhere in the field, one of the pens was making a small rhythmic sound against the wire stakes in the wind. If his corn fails, Caleb said slowly, and ours doesn't, let's not get ahead of ourselves, Martha said. A lot can still go wrong. And she was right about that. A lot could still go wrong, and some of it went wrong the very next day. She was checking the easternmost section, the one she'd been trying to decide whether to reach with the chicks before the nymphs progressed further, running calculations in her head about coverage versus timing, when she saw it. Not the shimmer she'd been watching in the lower field. Something different, denser. A solid darkness beneath the grass in the far northeast corner, a section she hadn't gotten the pens to yet, and when she got down and looked close, she felt her stomach drop in a cold, specific way. The hatch. There was 3 times worse than anything she'd seen in the lower field. 3 times, maybe more. The nymphs were stacked in the soil like they'd been poured in, clustered so thick under the grass stems that the grass itself was moving from them, pushed by the density of small bodies rather than by wind. And they were bigger than the ones she'd first found. Older. A week ahead of where she'd thought they were. She stood up and stood very still for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the top of her thigh, which was a thing she did when she was running numbers and didn't like the answer. Then she walked back to find Caleb. He was repairing the third pen's rear corner, the one that kept riding up on the right side. He looked at her face when she came across the field toward him and said, before she could speak, "What?" "We need more pens, and we need them in the northeast section by tomorrow morning. Martha, we don't have more materials. The old fence line along the north property edge. The posts and rails are still there. We pull them. That's the boundary. The boundary doesn't matter if there's nothing left to bound." She stopped in front of him. "Caleb, the northeast section is 3 times what we planned for. If we don't get the chicks in there in the next 24 hours, the nymphs will be too big for the day-olds to handle. We'll lose the east section and the corner of the corn rows." He looked at her. The afternoon light was brutal and flat, the kind that showed everything, and Martha was aware of all of it. The sweat on her face, the cut hands, the way she'd looked standing in that field with the new information sitting in her like a stone. She didn't try to hide any of it. There wasn't time. "Okay," Caleb said. He set down the tool he was holding. "Let's pull the fence." They pulled it that afternoon, both of them, prying the posts from the cracked earth and carrying them in sections across the property, while the sun moved and the shadows stretched and the temperature that had been punishing all day decided to become something personal. Rose sat in the shade of the sod house watching them with her steady dark eyes, too young to know what she was watching, old enough to understand that her parents were doing something serious. Martha built 2 new pens from the fence rails by lamplight, finishing the second one well after dark, her hands operating mostly by feel because the lamp didn't reach the far corners. She wasn't happy with either pen. The rails didn't lash the same way as the wagon board sections. They were heavier, less flexible, and the wire runners she bent for them sat differently than on the original frames. But they'd hold. She thought they'd hold. The next morning, she moved 60 chicks into the northeast section before breakfast. By midday, the chicks were working the thick hatch with the same focused intensity she'd seen in the lower field, and Martha stood at the edge of the section watching them and feeling something she didn't have a clean word for. Not relief, not satisfaction. Something more like the resolution of a specific tension, the way a drawn bowstring feels when the arrow finally releases. Not the end of effort, just the transformation of it into something that had direction. But the section was big, too big for 60 chicks to cover adequately in the time they had. She moved another 45 from the lower field, reducing coverage there to gamble on coverage here, and she spent the rest of that day watching both sections and running the numbers in her head, and accepting that the numbers did not fully add up. She was asking 200 and some birds to do work that required 400. She knew that. There wasn't another answer. You worked with what you had, the way Caleb had said on the first morning, and you tried to make the gap between what you had and what you needed as small as possible. And you did not spend time being afraid of the gap itself, because fear of the gap was not the same as closing it. On the 12th day, she found the first chick with a wing injury she recognized. A dog had gotten into the second pen sometime in the night. She couldn't tell whose dog. In a settlement this spread out, dogs operated with considerable independence. She repaired the pen wall, splinted what she could, and moved the injured birds into the barn, where she'd set up a small separate pen for the weakest of the flock. She'd been visiting that pen every morning since day 3. It had started with 11 birds too weak to compete in the main pens. Birds she'd isolated not because she expected them to survive, but because she couldn't bring herself to do the practical thing, which was to let them go. She didn't know why exactly. They were chickens. They were part of a farming operation. The practical thing was the right thing by every measure that mattered out here, but she kept visiting them, kept making sure the water was fresh and the feed was accessible. By day 12, 3 of the original 11 were still alive and growing, slowly, behind the curve of the main flock, but growing, and Martha sat with them each morning for a few minutes and did not question why she was doing it because some things don't need to be questioned, they just need to be done. On the 14th day, she went to the northeast section in the early morning to check the chick progress and found something that stopped her cold. The nymphs were changing. The ones along the far eastern edge, the oldest, the densest concentration she'd found, were showing the early signs of wing development. Still ground-bound, still crawling, but the wing buds were visible on the larger ones. She crouched in the dirt and looked at them up close, the way she'd looked at the very first signs 2 weeks ago, and the cold in her stomach came back. The specific variety she'd been trying to keep at bay for 14 days. They were running out of time. Not in the abstract, not in the theoretical way she'd been calculating since the beginning. In the actual concrete sense that in a matter of days, maybe a week, maybe less, the first of them would be airborne. And once they were airborne, what the chicks could do would be a fraction of what they'd been doing on the ground. And once enough of them were airborne and had joined with whatever broader swarm was gathering out beyond the horizon, she couldn't see past. She stood up. She did not let herself finish the thought, not because she was afraid to think it, but because there was nothing useful in thinking it all the way through right now. What was useful was the count in her head, the map she'd been building of which sections were cleared, which were partially cleared, which were still untouched, and how many birds she had and where they were, and what she could ask of them in the time that was left. She walked back across the field, fast, her knee registering protest with every step that she did not acknowledge, and she found Caleb fixing the water pipe joint at the creek. And she said, without preamble, "I need everything we have in the northeast section, all of it, starting today." He looked up from the pipe. "That leaves the lower field exposed. The lower field's already cleared enough to hold. The northeast hasn't been cleared enough. We have maybe a week before the first ones take wing, and after that we lose most of what we've built." Caleb straightened up. He looked at the sky. It was clear and flat and blue in the way that a prairie sky is blue, which is all the way from horizon to horizon without interruption. A blue that means nothing is hidden because there's nothing to hide behind. "Okay," he said. That afternoon, they consolidated everything. Every functioning pen, every bird they could account for, every bit of the operation that could be moved was moved to the northeast and east sections. The lower field was left with a smaller contingent, the weakest pens, the birds least suited for the heavy work. And Martha walked those sections one last time in the late afternoon sun and told herself the damage there would be manageable and believed it about 60%. That night she sat at the table again with her paper, and the paper was getting worn at the creases now, soft and slightly translucent, where the sweat from her hands had been, and she looked at the grid she'd drawn and compared it to the reality she'd been living for 2 weeks, and saw all the places they'd diverged, all the assumptions that hadn't held, all the ways the territory had taken her careful thinking and rearranged it. The plan was unrecognizable. What she was doing now barely resembled what she'd drawn that first night, but the fields were still there. The corn rows were still standing. 211 chicks, she'd lost 8 more this week. Attrition and one bad night, were alive and working and growing in a way she hadn't predicted, filling out faster than she'd expected, some of them starting to look less like chicks and more like young hens, their combs beginning to show, their movements getting less frantic and more considered. She folded the paper and put it away and thought about wing buds on nymphs. She thought about the horizon. She thought about what a sky full of winged grasshoppers looks like when it moves. She had been 11 years old the last time she'd seen it, standing in her mother's yard in Nebraska, watching the light go strange and the sound change quality. And she had not understood then, not fully, how completely a thing like that could take everything you had spent a year building and reduce it to nothing in the time it took to eat breakfast. She understood it now. What was coming, what she could feel gathering on the other side of the flat prairie horizon, was not something her 211 chicks could stop. She had never thought they could stop it. That was not the plan. The plan was more complicated than that and smaller than that, and she had to trust it even when it felt like not enough, which it had felt like every single day for 2 weeks. Caleb came in from checking the pens, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said the thing they were both thinking, which was, "When it comes, we'll find out if this was worth it." Instead, he said, "Second pen's wire is fraying on the south corner." "I'll fix it in the morning," Martha said. "Your hands—" "I'll fix it in the morning," she said again, and Caleb, who knew her well enough not to argue with that particular tone, said nothing more. She lay awake that night for a long time, listening to the prairie settle into itself and listening to the chicks in the field, their quiet nighttime sounds, the occasional shuffle and murmur of a flock that had learned over 2 weeks of hard days how to exist together. Out somewhere in the northeast field, a single bird was making a low, repetitive sound. Not distress, just the sound of a thing that was alive and knew it. Martha listened to it until she finally slept. Above the prairie, the stars were very clear and very far away, and the flat world beneath them was absolutely quiet, and the grass stood motionless in the still air. And beneath the grass, in the soil, something that had been waiting was beginning to change, was beginning to unfold, was beginning to prepare itself for the open sky. The bird that had been making that low repetitive sound in the northeast field was silent by morning. Martha noticed the silence before she noticed anything else. She lay in the dark for a moment after waking, listening to the particular quality of it, the way it sat differently than the usual pre-dawn quiet. Then she got up. The sky outside was wrong. Not dark exactly. It was the hour before sunrise, so dark was expected, but the darkness had a texture to it that the usual darkness didn't have. A thickness, something that cut off the stars along the southwestern horizon in a way that clouds didn't quite account for. Martha stood in the door of the sod house in her bare feet on the packed dirt threshold and looked at that horizon and felt something move through her that she didn't have a clean name for. It was the feeling a person gets when something they've been preparing for has stopped being a future event and become a present one. She went back inside and shook Caleb's shoulder. "It's coming," she said. He was awake before she finished the sentence. That was one of the things about Caleb. He didn't need time between sleep and functional. He sat up and looked at her, and looked at the window and said, "How far?" "Southwest. Maybe 6, 8 miles. Moving fast." He was already pulling on his boots. "The northeast pens. Get them first. I'll start with the corn rows." Rose was still asleep. Martha pulled the blanket up tighter around her, a gesture that took 2 seconds and was entirely useless against what was coming, and she did it anyway, and then she went outside. The sound reached them before the light changed. It was the sound she remembered from when she was 11, the one she'd tried to describe to Caleb when she'd first told him about the Nebraska farm, the one she'd never found the right words for. It wasn't loud, not at first. It was more like a change in the acoustic quality of the air itself, a low continuous vibration that sat just below the threshold of what you'd call a noise, but above the threshold of what you could ignore. Like 1,000 things moving through dry grass simultaneously, like the land itself had developed a frequency. Then it got louder. Martha was at the first cornrow pen by then, unhooking the rope from the stake, and she stopped for a moment and just listened. The sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere, the way sounds do when they're big enough to fill the space between sky and ground. And the southwestern horizon had gone from the dark texture she'd seen from the doorway to something more definite, a moving density that she could see now even in the pre-dawn gray. A mass. A migration. The kind of thing that doesn't register as a collection of individual creatures until you're inside it, and by then it's too late to think in terms of individual creatures. "Caleb," she called. "I hear it," he called back from somewhere in the northeast section. She started moving the pen. The rope burned her palms. The cuts from 2 weeks of wire work had just been starting to close, and the rope found every one of them with precision. And the pen was heavy because the ground had gotten fractionally harder in the past 2 days as whatever moisture remained evaporated, and the pen's runners didn't glide the way they'd glided on softer ground. She pulled anyway, hand over hand, covering the distance to the cornrow's edge in a series of heaving pulls that left her breathing hard and her knees sending messages she was not reading. 60 chicks inside the pen, disturbed by the movement and the sound, began their own kind of noise, not the relaxed murmur of the nighttime flock, something more alert, more reactive. They could feel what was coming too, in whatever way birds feel things, and they pushed against the pen walls in a collective agitation that made the whole frame shudder as Martha dragged it. The light changed. That was the moment Martha always came back to afterward, when she thought about that morning. Not the sound, not the first sight of the swarm from the doorway, not any of the things that came after. The moment the light changed, because it changed in a way that was simply wrong. The sun was well up by now, the Dakota sky doing its usual thing of going from gray to gold to the hard flat blue of a summer morning. And then the gold dimmed, not like clouds, not like weather, but like something was between the sun and the ground, something with mass and density, and the light that came through it was a different quality of light entirely. Older somehow, dimmer, the kind of light that makes colors look wrong and distances uncertain. Martha looked up. The sky was moving, not the sky itself. What was in the sky? A column of movement that extended from somewhere just above the horizon, up to a height she couldn't estimate. A living column, a river of wings and bodies that had caught the early light on its western edge and absorbed it on its eastern edge and made a moving wall between the sun and the earth. The sound was very loud now, not a drone anymore, not a vibration, a sound, a real concrete sound, the accumulated noise of millions of individual wings beating millions of individual beats, and beneath it, under it, a lower sound that took Martha a moment to identify. It was the sound of them landing. Of that many small bodies hitting that many plants and surfaces, the collective impact of an army of creatures that had decided the ground was where they were going. They hit the Gruber farm first. The Gruber place was 300 yards west of the Mercer property line, and Martha could see it from where she stood, had been able to see the Gruber cornfield most mornings of the past 2 weeks as a reference point, a reminder of what the crops in this section looked like when they weren't being worked by chickens around the clock. The Gruber corn was tall and straight and well-tended, and on a normal morning it was a reassuring sight, evidence that the land could still produce what it was asked to produce. On this morning, it lasted 4 minutes. Martha watched it happen. She couldn't not watch it. The leading edge of the swarm dropped onto the Gruber corn like a weighted net, like gravity had specifically targeted that field, and the tall, straight stalks that had been visible a moment before were simply gone. Not blown down, not knocked sideways, just consumed, covered, disappeared under the weight, and the feeding, and the sound of it from 300 yards away was a sound Martha felt in her teeth. "Move the pens," she shouted to Caleb, to herself, to the general situation. "Move everything now." What happened in the next 2 hours was a thing that Martha would spend years afterward trying to explain to people and never quite managing to, because the experience of it was not like anything that has clean language around it. It was not a battle, exactly, though it felt like one. It was not a disaster, exactly, though it contained disaster. It was a state of sustained and total emergency in which every decision was made with incomplete information in a fraction of the time required to make it properly. And the consequences of each decision were visible almost immediately. And sometimes the visible consequences were good, and sometimes they were very bad, and there was no pause between them. She and Caleb split without discussion. He took the northeast and east sections, the ones most critical, the ones the chicks had been working hardest for 2 weeks. And she took the corn rows and the south end, and they didn't see each other for the first 40 minutes, except as distant moving shapes in a light that had gone the color of old pewter under the mass of the swarm. The grasshoppers were everywhere. That sounds obvious. A swarm is everywhere. But the everywhere of it was something Martha had to relearn in real time, because she'd been operating for 2 weeks in a world where the grasshoppers were on the ground and the chicks were also on the ground. And the contest between them was a ground-level contest she could see and manage and think about. What the swarm changed was the dimensionality. They were on the ground, yes, but they were also on the corn stalks, on the bean plants, on the pen walls, on Martha's arms and face, and in her hair and in her mouth when she opened it to call to Caleb, and they were in the air at every height she could see, and the noise of them was a physical thing, a pressure against the eardrums that didn't stop. She opened the first pen. This was the moment she'd been building toward for 18 days. The strategy that had seemed either brilliant or insane, depending on who in the settlement you asked. The reason they'd spent the last $18 and watched 63 chicks die in the first 2 days, and pulled fence posts in the afternoon heat, and hauled crocks of water a half-mile on a bad knee. The moment the birds met the swarm. The chicks exploded out of the pen like something that had been waiting to be released. They were not day-olds anymore. 18 days had done real work on them. They were half-grown birds now, not quite laying size, but close on some of the faster developing ones, with the leg strength and the feeding drive of young birds in peak condition. And they had been eating grasshoppers for 18 days. Ground-level nymphs, yes, but grasshoppers, and the scent and the movement and the specific frantic quality of swarming insects was something they knew. It was what they'd been doing every day. It was the closest thing to normal that their short lives contained. They hit the grasshoppers with a focus that Martha had not seen in anything except, possibly, Caleb in the middle of a mechanical problem that needed solving. She didn't have time to watch. She was already at the second pen, unhooking it, swinging the gate, releasing the next 60, and then she was moving toward the third pen, which was in the corn rows, and the corn rows were bad. The leading edge of the swarm had hit the south end of the corn before she'd reached it, and the sound in the corn rows was particular. The dry mechanical sound of feeding, of mandibles on plant material, multiplied by the thousands. And the plants themselves were moving in a way that plants don't naturally move, the stalks trembling under the weight of the insects on them. Martha stepped into the corn rows. She should have been afraid. The practical, sensible response to walking into the dense interior of a grasshopper swarm was something closer to retreat. The insects were in her hair immediately, on her neck, inside her collar, and the impulse to stop and claw them off was strong, and she did not stop. She reached the third pen, which was in the middle of the rows, and she could not see Caleb, and she could not see the northeast field, and she could not see anything except corn stalks and grasshoppers, and the 60 birds in the pen pushing against the wire with a frenzy that told her they could smell what was on the other side. She opened the gate. The birds poured into the corn rows, and Martha stood there for a moment in the middle of it all. The sound, the movement, the insects on every surface, including her own skin, the birds running in every direction through the rows with their heads down and working. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, this is it. This is the whole bet, right here. Then the fourth pen's wall gave out. The sound of the wire failing was distinctive, a sharp metal snap followed by the pop of the corner post pulling free of the ground, and she heard it before she saw it. The pen was 30 yards east of the corn rows, and it came apart at the rear corner, the way a thing comes apart when it's been under stress for 18 days, and the last piece of stress is one piece too many. The wire runner on the south side pulled free, the frame torqued, and the whole rear wall tilted inward and then outward, and then 80 birds discovered simultaneously that one side of their world had opened. Martha ran. The distance was 30 yards. Her knee was already registering damage from the morning's work, a deep grinding sensation she was categorizing as something to deal with later. and she ran across the rough ground between the corn rows and the failed pen and got there in time to grab the swinging wall section and hold it, barely, both hands gripping the frame while the birds churned around her feet in every direction. She couldn't hold it and close it at the same time. "Caleb!" she called. Her voice was swallowed by the sound of the swarm. The sound was like weather. It had a volume that absorbed other sounds, ate them, left no echo. "Caleb!" Nothing. She made a decision. She let the wall go. She let it go and stepped back and let 80 birds add themselves to the open field. Because holding the pen wall was not as important as what the birds in the pen were eating and where they were eating it, and the field was the field. And if they scattered across the field, that was different from what she'd planned, but the field was where the grasshoppers were, and it would have to be enough. The pen wall fell. 80 birds ran outward in a radius that looked for a moment like chaos. Then the nearest ones found grasshoppers and stopped running and started eating. And the ones farther out found grasshoppers and did the same. And the radius froze and became a feeding line instead, and Martha stood in the middle of it and thought, okay, that works. That's not the plan, but it works. She turned around to go back to the corn rows and found Hector Grimes standing 15 feet away. He had come across the field, across the property line, through the swarm, and he was standing there with his hat in his hands and his face doing something complicated. He was covered in grasshoppers, his coat, his shoulders, his hat, the way everyone and everything was covered this morning, but he didn't seem to be brushing them off. He seemed to have forgotten they were there. He was looking at the birds working the field and at the corn rows where the other birds were visible between the stalks, and at Martha. "My corn's gone," he said. His voice was different from the voice she'd heard at the fence 2 weeks ago. That voice had been Hector Grimes performing Hector Grimes. This voice was just a man standing in a field that had lost everything. Martha looked at him. "I'm sorry. I need—" He stopped, started again. "Can your birds work a section of my east field? The beans are still—" "I can't," Martha said, not unkindly. "I don't have enough birds to cover what I've got. I can't split the flock." He nodded once. Something in his face that had been held together by the performance of his usual certainty was not held together anymore. "I just thought—" "I know what you thought," Martha said. "I'm sorry, Hector. I truly am, but I can't." He put his hat back on, stood there another moment. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come, back across the field, back through the property line. And Martha watched him go and felt something about it that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite grief, and sat somewhere between them where feelings go when they're too complicated to name quickly. Then she went back to work. She found Caleb in the northeast section 20 minutes later, and finding him was its own small crisis because the northeast section looked nothing like it had when she'd last seen it. The swarm had hit it from the north, which she hadn't anticipated. She'd expected the main line of follow the same southwest to northeast path. It had taken over the Gruber farm, but the swarm had feathered, as swarms do, the main column sending trailing edges in irregular directions. And one of those trailing edges had come down the north side of the property and hit the northeast section from an angle Martha hadn't protected against. Caleb was in the middle of it, physically in it, dragging the second northeast pen by main force across a section that the grasshoppers had already partially stripped. His face set and rigid, his shirt soaked through with sweat and covered with insects, moving with a determination that Martha recognized as the point past fear and past rational calculation, where a person is simply doing the thing because stopping is not an option. "The north edge," she called to him. "I know," he called back. "I got to it 20 minutes ago. It was already stripped. I'm pulling south toward the bean rows." "How many birds?" 100 and something. I opened the third pen when the north edge went. They're spread—" A sound from the direction of the barn cut him off. Not a normal barn sound. A sound that Martha's brain cataloged and flagged before her conscious mind caught up with the flagging. Wood under pressure. The particular crack of a stressed joint giving way. The barn pen. The small recovery pen in the barn where she'd been keeping the weakest birds. The ones she'd refused to let go. The ones Caleb had looked at twice with the expression of a man who understood the economics of the situation better than he was willing to say out loud. Martha had checked them at 4 in the morning as part of her pre-dawn round, and the 3 survivors from the original 11 weak birds had been alive and quiet and slow, as they always were, smaller than the main flock birds by a significant margin, still behind the curve. She ran back to the barn. The barn's south-facing door had been pushed open by the swarm. Grasshoppers in numbers like this pushed through every gap, every space, every imperfection in any structure, and the barn door had a gap at the bottom where the wood had warped in the summer heat. And the inside of the barn was not the dim, separate space it usually was. It was the outside brought inside, the same gray, swarming light, the same sound, the same density of moving bodies. The pen in the corner had lost its canvas roof cover, which had been held by two stakes that apparently the grasshoppers had made irrelevant, and inside the pen the three surviving birds from the weak cohort were doing what the birds in the field were doing, eating. Three small birds, undersized, behind the curve of the main flock by 2 weeks of growth, eating grasshoppers out of the barn floor with a focused intensity that was, under the circumstances, almost funny. Martha stood in the barn door for a moment. Then she did something she hadn't done all morning. She laughed. It came out rough and quick, more air than sound, but it was a laugh, and she put one hand against the barn door frame and let it happen for 3 seconds, and then she stopped. She reinforced the pen cover with the nearest thing to hand, which was a section of old harness leather she tacked across the frame with 2 nails, and she made sure the water crock was full, and she went back to the field. The next hour was the worst one. The worst not because of the swarm itself. By mid-morning, the main body had moved, had followed the line of least resistance northeast toward the untouched fields beyond the settlement boundary, but because of what the moving swarm revealed about the damage. The trailing edge left fields bare in strips and patches that followed no logic. Martha could map the random appetite of millions of individual feeders rather than any unified strategy, and the strips and patches were in places she hadn't expected and hadn't prepared for and couldn't have prepared for. The south end of the corn rows was gone. She stood at the south end of the corn rows and looked at what remained and made the assessment in the flat, way she made assessments when emotion was a cost she couldn't afford right now. Gone meant gone. Not damaged, not stripped to stubs that might recover, but eaten at ground level, the stalks cut clean with the precision of insects that don't leave things by accident. Perhaps 15–18% of the total corn rows. The south-facing end, the end that had taken the first edge of the swarm before she'd gotten the third pen opened. The north end of the corn rows was still standing. She walked the length of them. The birds in the rows had done their work. She could see the evidence, the worked soil between the rows where the chicks had been hunting, the dramatically lower density of grasshoppers in the sections the birds had covered versus the sections they hadn't. The north end had coverage. The middle had coverage. The south end, which she'd been planning to reach last and hadn't reached in time, was where the swarm had found its first purchase. She stood at the boundary between what was lost and what was saved, and she put her hand on a corn stalk at that boundary. One of the northernmost stalks of the damaged section, not quite stripped, a few leaves still on it, the ear damaged but potentially recoverable. And she held it, and she stood there a moment in the diminishing sound of the swarm moving away to the northeast, and she let herself feel the full weight of what the south end represented. 15–18% of the corn, maybe more. The south bean section had damage too. She'd seen it as she walked. Not total, not the way the south corn was total, but significant. This was food, this was income. This was the calculation she'd been running for 3 weeks, and the calculation had always assumed some loss, had been built on the assumption that the chicks couldn't stop everything, could only reduce the damage to survivable levels. The question was whether the damage was survivable. She didn't know yet. She wouldn't know until she'd walked every row, counted every standing stalk, assessed every bean plant, and calculated what the yield would be from what remained. That would take hours, and she didn't have the hours yet because the swarm's trailing edges were still moving through the property's outer sections, and there were birds to manage and pens to secure. She let go of the corn stalk and walked back north. Caleb was waiting at the junction between the corn rows and the northeast section, and he looked at her face with the particular attention of a man who has learned to read what a person's face is doing when that person is actively trying not to show anything. "How bad?" he said. "South end is gone, 15, maybe 18%. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him absorb it. "The north rows?" he asked. "Standing. The beans in the north section are standing. I haven't checked the east field." He nodded. He had a cut above his left eyebrow that Martha hadn't noticed before. Not serious, the kind of cut a person gets from a wire end or a rough surface in a hurry, but it had bled down the side of his face and dried there, dark against his weathered skin. She reached up and touched the edge of it with 2 fingers. "That needs cleaning," she said. "Later." "It needs cleaning. Martha." His voice was patient and tired. "Later." She took her hand back. Fair enough. They walked the east field together, which was the field she'd been most worried about before the swarm, and was now, by some combination of the chick's work and the swarm's particular path, the field she was least worried about. The east section, the one where she'd found the worst nymph density on day 14, the one she'd consolidated the whole operation to cover in those final days, showed the kind of damage that was in a different category from the south corn. Not the category of total loss, the category of heavy but partial, the kind of damage a crop can sustain and still produce a yield worth talking about. The chicks had been there. You could see where they'd been. The swarm had come through. Yes, there was no part of the property that the swarm had not touched. But the population it had met in the east field was not the population it had met in the south corn. In the south corn, it had met a field that was full and ready and undefended. In the east field, it had met a field that had been systematically worked by 100 and some birds for 18 days, a field where the nymph population had been reduced to a fraction of what it would otherwise have been, which meant the swarm had found less immediate food, which meant the swarm had moved through faster, which meant the damage was significant but not terminal. "The east field's going to produce," Martha said. She said it flat, just a statement, not a celebration. Caleb looked at the rows and didn't say anything immediately. "Caleb." "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, it's going to produce." They stood there a moment, both of them, in the east field that was going to produce, and neither of them said anything. There was something between them in that moment that didn't need words and would have been diminished by them. The particular shared experience of 2 people who have been doing a hard thing together and have come through to the other side of it and can now see both the cost and what the cost bought. The sun had come fully out. The swarm was audible still, to the northeast, but diminishing, the sound losing its weight, returning toward the threshold where it would stop being something you felt in your chest and become something you just heard. The light over the east field was ordinary light again, the hard flat blue gold of a Dakota summer morning, shadows where shadows were supposed to be. Then they heard it from the northeast section, the sound of a pen giving way. The third northeast pen, the one built from fence rails, the one Martha had never been entirely happy with, lost its rear corner post under circumstances that Martha later attributed to a combination of the swarm's weight on the canvas top and the post itself, which she'd sunk into ground that was slightly softer than the rest of the section, and which had probably been loosening for several days without being visible from the outside. The post pulled free and the canvas came down, and 60 birds found their rear wall gone and exercised their judgment accordingly. Martha ran. Caleb ran. They got to the pen from opposite sides and met in the middle, which would have been almost comic under different circumstances, and the birds were already distributing themselves across the northeast section in a radius that was disorganized but not entirely unhelpful. Disorganized feeding in a field still under swarm pressure was not the same as disorganized feeding in an empty field. The birds were still eating. They were just not eating in the places she'd planned for them to eat. "Leave it," Martha said, when Caleb moved to start rounding them up. He looked at her. "Leave it," she said again. "The section's already worked. They can't make it worse, and they're still eating. Let them have the northeast section, and we'll collect them this evening." He looked at the scattered birds, and at the section, and at Martha. 60 birds loose in the northeast. "Caleb, let it go." He let it go. She walked the rest of the property through the tail end of the swarm, which was still moving through the outer edges. The property's west boundary, where they'd never planted and had no investment, and the north strip along the fence line they'd pulled for pen material. She walked with her arms at her sides and the insects landing on her and leaving again, the constant restless movement of the swarm's final hours in this location. The swarm's attention already shifted toward the northeast horizon, where there were presumably more fields, more crops, more of what it was looking for. She found one of the 3 barn birds in the northwest corner of the property, standing on a fence post, eating grasshoppers off the post surface with complete composure. How it had gotten there from the barn she couldn't account for. It looked at her when she approached, and then looked back at the fence post with the attitude of a creature that had priorities. Martha stood in front of the fence post and looked at the small bird for a moment. Then she put her hands on her hips and looked out at the northwest horizon and thought about the south corn and the east field and the bean section and the 100 and some birds loose in the northeast section and the 3 birds in the barn, recovery pen, and whether two of those three were now two or two and the one on the fence post. She thought about Hector Grimes walking back across the property line with his hat on and his face not doing what it usually did. She thought about $18. She turned around and started back across the property, toward the sod house, toward the fields that were still standing, toward Caleb, who was somewhere in the middle section collecting birds, and she walked with the particular gait of a person who is very tired, and whose knee is very bad, and who is not thinking about either of those things because there is work still to do today and more work tomorrow. When she got back to the sod house, Rose was awake. She had pulled herself upright against the cot frame and was standing, which was a thing she'd been doing for 3 weeks, but always with something to hold. She was watching the door when Martha came in. She had both fists raised to approximately ear level, which was her neutral position for standing, and she looked at Martha with the dark, serious eyes she'd had since birth. "Hey, little one," Martha said. Rose said something that was not quite a word but had the intonation of a question. "I know," Martha said. She crouched, her knee screamed, and picked Rose up and stood again. "I know it was loud. It's quieter now." Rose put one hand flat against Martha's cheek in that way she had, the way that meant she was checking that Martha was real and present, and Martha stood in the middle of the sod house holding her daughter and listening to the diminishing sound of the swarm moving away to the northeast, and thought about survivable. Was it survivable? She ran the numbers with Rose on her hip, in her head, the way she'd been running numbers for 3 weeks. South corn at 15 to 18% loss. East field partial damage but producing. Bean section moderate. The flock down to, she didn't have an exact count yet, wouldn't have it until evening when she and Caleb collected the loose birds from the northeast section and did a full tally, somewhere between 190 and 210, she estimated. The 3 barn birds, assuming all 3 accounted for. The one on the fence post. Survivable. The words sat in her head with a quality she hadn't expected. Not relief, not triumph, something flatter than either. Something that was essentially, yes, this is survivable. That's what we bought with $18 and 3 weeks of work, and 63 birds dead in the first 2 days and a bad knee and cut hands, and Hector Grimes looking at her the way Hector Grimes always looked at her. That's what it bought. Survivable. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The evening brought Caleb back from the northeast section with a head count and a split lip he'd gotten from a pen frame swinging back and catching him in the face, and they sat at the table after Rose was asleep and added up the numbers together, going over the count twice to make sure, and when they were done, they sat with the numbers between them on the table, like something physical. 197 birds. Not 211. 14 lost in the swarm out to scatter and predation, and 1 pen collapse she hadn't been there to manage. But 197 was a number. It was a real flock. It was a number that had weight and meaning and consequence. "The South corn," Caleb said. "I know. We're going to be short on winter stores." "I know, Caleb. We'll need to sell some of the birds earlier than—" "I know." She looked at him across the table. "I know. We'll figure it out." He looked at her for a moment, then, "You were right." She didn't say anything. "Martha, you were right. The South corn's still gone," she said. "I know the South corn's gone." His voice was not impatient, just direct. "I'm saying you were right about the rest of it. The East field's standing because of what you did. The bean section's going to produce because of what you did. We've got a flock because of what you did." Martha looked at the table, at the worn piece of paper that was still sitting at the edge of it, the grid she'd drawn the first night, now so far from what the actual operation had been that it was almost a different document. She picked it up and looked at it for a moment and then folded it carefully along its existing creases. "Go clean that cut," she said, "before it gets infected." He almost laughed. It came out as a long breath with something at the end of it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Outside, the prairie had gone fully quiet. The swarm was gone. She could feel the absence of it, the particular return of normal silence after abnormal sound, the way a room feels when a machine that's been running stops. The stars were out, the full Dakota spread of them, unobstructed from horizon to horizon in the way that was one of this territory's few uncomplicated gifts. The fields were there. Damaged, yes. Partial. Less than she'd hoped and more than she'd had reason to expect. Her flock was there. 197 birds settled into the pens for the night, eating and living and growing toward the laying age that was still 6 or 8 weeks away, but was now, for the first time since she'd handed $15 to Dunmore in his chicken-smelling barn, something she could call a concrete and approaching reality rather than a bet. She stood outside the sod house for a few minutes before going in, looking at the sky, not thinking about anything in particular. Just standing, just breathing, just being a person who had made a decision and lived through the consequences of it and was still here. The fence post where she'd found the barn bird was empty. The bird had come back to the barn on its own, apparently deciding that the fence post had given it everything useful it was going to give. Martha went inside, and the door closed behind her, and the prairie night held its silence, and the 197 birds in the field breathed and rustled and settled, and the corn that was still standing stood, and the corn that was gone, and neither of those things would change before morning. The morning after the swarm, the settlement looked like something that had been turned inside out. Martha saw it on her way to check the east field at first light, the particular quality of damage that a grasshopper swarm leaves behind, which is different from storm damage or drought damage in that it is total and specific simultaneously. A storm takes everything randomly. A drought takes everything gradually. A swarm takes exactly what it wants and leaves the rest, and what it leaves behind has a quality of deliberate selection that feels almost personal, as if the land itself had decided which things were worth keeping and which were not. The Gruber farm was stripped to bare stalks on 3 sides. She could see it from the road without stopping. The corn that had been tall and straight 2 days ago was cut to ankle height, brown and dry, the kind of cut-clean damage that left nothing to salvage and nothing to misunderstand. The Gruber fields had been among the most productive in the settlement. Whatever Emmett Gruber had planned to do with his harvest, the debts he was carrying, the improvements he'd been saving toward, the winter stores his family depended on, all of it had been revised downward in a single morning. She didn't stop at the Gruber fence. She kept walking. The Pellman place was worse. The Pellman family had 4 children and a sick draft horse and a history of seasons that had been bad in ways that compounded each other, and what the swarm had done to their south field was the kind of thing that makes a person stop doing arithmetic because the arithmetic only goes one direction. Martha had spoken to Clara Pellman twice since moving to the settlement, brief encounters at the grain store, the kind of acquaintance that lived in nods and weather comments, and hadn't graduated to anything more personal. She thought about Clara Pellman now as she walked, about what Clara Pellman's morning looked like, and she kept the thought in the part of her head where she kept the things she couldn't fix yet. Her own east field was where she'd left it the night before. That was the thing she had to keep reminding herself, not because she'd forgotten, but because the mind has a way of revising things overnight, of softening the memory of damage and sharpening the memory of loss, and she needed to see it clearly for what it was rather than for what fear wanted it to be. She walked the rows in the early light, the same rows she'd walked the evening before, and the damage was the same damage she'd counted then. Significant in the south, partial in the east, manageable in the bean section, and the north and central corn rows still standing in a way that was not a miracle, but was the direct result of 18 days of work and 197 birds, and a gravity-fed water pipe that Willard at the hardware store was going to receive payment for in eggs come October. She stood in the central corn rows for a few minutes, just standing, the way she'd stood the night before, but in different light. The morning light on a standing corn stalk looked different from the evening light on the same stalk, and she wanted to see it in both, wanted to fix the image of a standing crop in her memory, the way you fix a thing you need to refer back to when things get difficult. When she got back to the sod house, Caleb had Rose on his lap and was trying to eat breakfast left-handed, while Rose used his right arm as a mechanism for practicing her standing. His split lip was scabbed over and looked worse than it had the night before, the way these things always look worse on the second day, and he looked at Martha over Rose's head when she came in. "Eastfield?" he said. "Same as last night." He nodded. Rose made a sound of complaint about the standing situation, and Caleb adjusted his arm and she resumed. "Someone's going to come by today," Martha said. He looked at her. "From the settlement. Maybe more than one someone." She poured water into the basin and started washing her hands. "The damage out there is bad. People are going to be looking at our fields, and they're going to have questions." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Let them look." "That's what I intend," Martha said. The first person came before noon. It was not who Martha expected. She expected Hector Grimes. Grimes had the personality of a man who processes a defeat by turning immediately toward the next advantage. And the next advantage available to him was whatever Martha knew that he didn't. Instead, the person who came to the fence was Emmett Gruber. And Emmett Gruber came with his hat in his hands, and his eyes carrying something that Martha recognized as the specific expression of a man who has been awake all night doing arithmetic and has arrived at a number he cannot afford. I was a tall man, thinner than his height suggested, with the kind of permanent squint that came from years of watching horizons for weather. Martha had spoken to him perhaps half a dozen times in the 2 years they'd been in the settlement, more than she'd spoken to Clara Pellman, less than she'd spoken to most. He'd never been unkind to her. He'd also never been particularly present, which in a settlement of this size was a different kind of thing from kindness. He stood at the fence and looked at her east field for a long moment before he said anything. "I need to understand what you did," he said finally. Martha wiped her hands on her apron. "Come around to the gate," she said. "I'll walk you through it." She walked him through it, all of it. The nymph identification, the timing, the pen design, the water system, the sequence of coverage. She showed him the pens, the bent wire runners, the gravity feed pipe sitting half exposed in its shallow trench, the section of fence rail she'd pulled and repurposed, the willow branch lashings. She showed him without commentary or editorializing, the way you show someone a mechanical system because you want them to understand the mechanics, not because you want credit for building it. He walked next to her and looked at everything she pointed at and said very little. Once, when she showed him the wire runner design, the curved bend she'd figured out by trial and error on the first morning, he crouched down and looked at it up close for a long time without speaking. When she finished, he stood at the edge of the east field with his arms crossed and looked at the standing rows. "The chicks," he said. "How many did you lose?" 145 from 342. "In how long?" 18 days, most in the first 3. He nodded slowly. "So you need to account for that in the initial purchase." It wasn't a question, but Martha answered it anyway. "You buy for the loss. You don't buy the number you need, you buy a third again more than the number you need, and you assume you'll lose a percentage before they're strong enough to work." Emmett Gruber uncrossed his arms and put his hands in his pockets, which was the posture of a man moving from receiving information to thinking about it. He looked at the corn rows for another long moment. "If I'd done this," he said, and stopped. "Your south field would still be gone," Martha said, because it was true, and she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. "The swarm hit your place before it hit ours. Your south section didn't have time to benefit from the pre-work regardless. But your east field—" She paused. "Your east field might have looked different." He breathed in slowly through his nose. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I thought." He looked at her then, directly, the way people in this territory didn't always look at Martha directly, and the look was not the kind she was accustomed to from the men in this settlement. It was the look of one person taking the full measure of another person and being prepared to report an honest result. "I owe you an apology," he said. Martha waited. "I laughed," he said, "at the grain store. When Grimes said what he said, I laughed. I want you to know I remember that." Martha held his gaze. "I remember it too," she said, because that was also true. "I'm sorry for it." She looked at him for a moment. Then, "I know you are," she said. "Tell me about your east field. How many acres?" They talked for another 2 hours, standing in the east field and sitting at the table inside and then standing at the fence again on his way out. She answered every question he asked and a few he didn't know to ask yet. When he left with a rough sketch she'd drawn of the pen design and the water system, done on the same kind of paper she'd used for her original grid 3 weeks ago, and he held it with the careful hands of someone who understood the value of what they were carrying. Caleb, watching from the sod house door, waited until Gruber's wagon was out of sight. "How many acres is his east field?" he asked. 42, Martha said. "How many chicks to work 42 acres adequately?" "At the density I used?" 450, allowing for loss. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He's going to need to find a supplier." "Yes, he is," Martha said. The second visitor came that same afternoon, and this one Martha had expected. Eleanor Voss was the wife of the settlement's largest landowner after Grimes, a sharp, practical woman in her 50s, who had been in this territory since before the sod houses, and who had accumulated, in Martha's observation, more actual understanding of how things worked than her husband got credit for managing. Eleanor had never laughed at Martha at the grain store. She also had never made any particular effort to speak to her, which was a form of neutrality that Martha had neither resented nor relied on. She came in a wagon, she drove herself, which was characteristic, and she didn't bother with the fence formality. She pulled up to the gate, tied off the horse, and came through the gate without asking, which was also characteristic, and she looked at the fields and at the pens and at Martha. "Tell me about the pen system," Eleanor said. "Specifically the mobility. Emmett Gruber is not mechanically inclined, and his sketch made no sense." Martha almost smiled. "Come in and I'll draw you a better one." Eleanor Voss stayed 3 hours. She asked different questions than Emmett Gruber had asked, sharper in some places, less detailed in others, oriented toward logistics and scale rather than toward the basic mechanics. She asked about the mortality rate 3 times, approaching it from different angles each time, the way someone does when they're trying to establish a range rather than a number. She asked about the water system in detail and made her own sketch of it, independent of the one Martha offered, and compared the two. She asked, at one point, about the chicks Martha had kept in the barn, the weak ones, the ones that by any practical standard should have been let go. Martha told her. Eleanor looked at her for a moment. "That doesn't make economic sense," she said. Not unkindly, just as an observation. "I know," Martha said, "but they survived." 2 of the 3 did. The third one on the fence post, I'm not entirely sure where that one ended up. Eleanor Voss made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a concession. "You kept birds that anyone else would have culled, and they came through the worst swarm this territory's seen in 8 years. I kept them because I couldn't let them go," Martha said. "That's the honest answer. I'm not going to make it sound smarter than it was." Eleanor looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time in Martha's experience of her, something warmer than assessment. "You're more honest than most people I know," she said. "I find it saves time," Martha said. They sat with that for a moment. Rose, who had been navigating the floor between them with increasing confidence, grabbed Eleanor Voss's boot and used it as a standing post and looked up at Eleanor with the frank curiosity of a child who hasn't learned yet that some adults aren't interested in being looked at. Eleanor looked back at Rose. "How old?" 22 months. "She's going to be trouble," Eleanor said, and it sounded like a compliment. By the time Eleanor left, the light was angling toward late afternoon, and 2 more wagons had slowed on the road to look at the Mercer fields, neither of them stopping, just slowing, looking, moving on. Martha noticed them from the corner of her vision while she was checking the afternoon water levels in the main trough, and she noted them without comment. The settlement was starting to understand what it was looking at. Word in a territory this sparse moved in its own particular way. Not like gossip in a town, which moved fast and loose and got amplified with each telling, but more like water finding its level, slow and inevitable, following the terrain of who knew whom, and who owed what, and who was seen at whose fence, until eventually the information was everywhere, without anyone being able to say exactly how it got there. By the second day after the swarm, the shape of what had happened on the Mercer property was common knowledge. The overweight woman's impossible plan had worked, partially and expensively and with significant loss. But in a season that had stripped every other farm in the section, the Mercer fields were still producing. The third day brought a visitor Martha had no preparation for. She was in the northeast section, back to the daily management of the flock, which did not pause for reflection or external recognition. 197 birds still requiring water and feed management and pen rotation, the swarm's departure having changed the nature of the work without eliminating it. When she heard the wagon on the road and looked up to see it was a woman she didn't recognize. The wagon was better than average, the horse a quality animal, and the woman driving it was perhaps 60 years old, with white hair pinned neatly and the upright posture of someone who had not negotiated with their spine in a long time. The woman tied the horse and came to the fence and looked at Martha across the field distance. "Mrs. Mercer?" she called. Martha came across the field. "I am. My name is Adeline Foss. I'm from the Territorial Agricultural Council." She said it the way someone says the name of an organization to a person who might not know what it is, watching for the response. "We've been traveling the affected sections since the swarm, documenting what happened, what held and what didn't." Martha looked at her. "All right. May I come in?" Martha opened the gate. Adeline Foss was not like Emmett Gruber or Eleanor Voss. She didn't want to understand the system in order to replicate it. She wanted to understand it in a larger sense, what it represented, how it fit into the broader question of how settlements in Grasshopper Territory managed infestation risk, what could be generalized from it, and what was specific to the conditions of this particular farm. She had a leather notebook, and she wrote in it while Martha talked quickly, with a shorthand that Martha caught glimpses of and found herself curious about. She asked about the initial decision, what Martha had observed, how she'd connected the nymph presence to the swarm risk, why she'd chosen chicks rather than waiting for confirmation. I'd seen it before, Martha said. When I was a child. Once you've seen it, you don't need confirmation. The signs are the signs. Most of the farm operators I've spoken to in this section saw similar signs, Adeline Foss said. None of them acted on it. Martha was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. Why did you when they didn't? Martha thought about that. It was not a question she'd been asked directly, though it was implicit in everything that had happened since the morning at Dunmore's farm. She thought about how to answer it honestly without making it sound like a lesson, which was not what she intended and not what it was. Because we had nothing left to lose in a way that the other operators didn't, she said finally. Emmett Gruber had a plan that made sense. The Pellmans had a plan. Everyone had a plan, and their plans were reasonable. Ours was the same plan, and I knew it was going to fail. So the calculation was different for me than for them. It wasn't that I was smarter or braver. It was that the reasonable option was clearly not going to work, so the unreasonable option was the only one left. Adeline Foss stopped writing. She looked up. That's the clearest account I've heard of agricultural risk tolerance in 10 years of doing this work, she said. Martha didn't know what to do with that, so she said nothing. The pen system, Adeline said, going back to her notebook. You designed it yourself? I designed it the first morning, and then I redesigned it 5 more times as things went wrong. Where did the original concept come from? Martha told her about Edna Garrett and the farm east of Hebron, and Adeline Foss wrote that down too, with the specificity of someone who understood that an idea has a history and the history matters. When the interview, if that was what it was over, Adeline Foss closed her notebook and stood and looked at the east field for a long moment. There are going to be more swarms, she said. It wasn't a prediction so much as a statement of existing reality. The conditions that produced this one haven't changed. The settlements in this territory are going to face this again, probably within 3 to 5 years. I know, Martha said. What you figured out here, the timing, the pen system, the pre-treatment of the field, it needs to be in wider use before the next one comes. Martha looked at her. That's why you're here. That's partly why I'm here, Adeline said. She paused. The council is putting together a practical guide for territorial farmers, methods that held against the swarm. Yours is the only operation in this section that held. Another pause. Would you be willing to contribute a written description of your methods? Technical enough to be useful, plain enough to be understood by someone with no prior knowledge. Martha thought about the worn piece of paper in the drawer of the table inside. The grid she'd drawn the first night, now so different from what the operation had actually been. She thought about whether she could describe, in plain language, something that she had figured out largely by failing and failing differently and adjusting again. I can do that, she said. Adeline Foss nodded once. She put the notebook in her bag. She was almost to the gate when she turned back. One more thing, she said. The birds you kept in the barn. The weak ones you didn't cull. Martha waited. I heard about those from Eleanor Voss. She told me you said it wasn't a smart decision, just something you couldn't bring yourself not to do. That's right. Adeline Foss looked at her for a moment. 2 of those birds are now among the healthiest in your laying stock, from what Eleanor described. The 3rd one is somewhere, Martha said. I think it's the one that keeps appearing on the fence post in the northwest corner, but I'm not certain. Something moved in Adeline Foss's face that was not quite a smile but was in the same family. The decisions we make because we can't bring ourselves not to make them are sometimes the most important ones, she said, even when we can't justify them. She went through the gate. Martha watched her drive away down the road. Caleb had heard the last part of the conversation from the sod house door, where he'd been standing with Rose on his hip. He waited until the wagon was well down the road. Agricultural Council, he said. So she said, You're going to write a guide. She wants a technical description of the methods. I said I would. Caleb looked at her. You're going to write it tonight, aren't you? I need to check the water levels first, Martha said. Martha, and the North Penn corner still needs the wire replaced on the east side. Martha. She looked at him. You're allowed to let this be a good day, he said. Quiet, direct. The way Caleb said the important things. She held his gaze for a moment, and something in her chest did a thing that was not quite tears and not quite the absence of them, but somewhere on the border, which was as close as she got in the middle of a day that still had work in it. I know, she said. She went to check the water levels. On the fourth day after the swarm, Hector Grimes came to the fence. She'd been expecting him. She'd been expecting him the first day, and then the second day, and when he hadn't come, she'd revised her estimate. He was a man who needed more time than Emmett Gruber to make the internal adjustment required by what had happened, needed to process the gap between the story he'd told himself about Martha Mercer and the story the Eastfield was now telling, and that processing, for a man of Hector Grimes's particular construction, took longer than 1 day or two. On the fourth day he came to the fence and he stood there, and Martha saw him from the northeast section where she was running the morning water check, and she walked across the field to the fence, and she stood on her side of it, and she looked at him. He looked worse than he had the morning of the swarm, when he'd come across the property line with his hat in his hands. His coat was clean now, which meant he'd made an effort, but his face had the particular look of a man who has been doing arithmetic for 4 days and has not liked any of the answers. His south field was visible from his side of the road. She didn't need to turn and look. She'd looked at it enough in the past 4 days to know exactly what it looked like. And the sight of it had presumably accompanied him on the walk to her fence and was continuing to accompany him now. He did not say what she'd expected him to say. She'd expected something about the pens, about the methods, the practical request dressed in minimal preamble. That was what she'd prepared for. What he said was, I've been trying to figure out what to say to you. Martha waited. I've known you 2 years, he said, and He stopped, looked at his hands on the fence rail, looked up. I made up my mind about you before I had any reason to, and then every time I talked to you, I was talking to the idea I had of you instead of... He stopped again. This was visibly costing him. Instead of you. Martha looked at him. The sun was behind her and in his eyes slightly, which was not something she'd arranged, but which she noticed. I know what you did for this settlement, Grimes said. I know that what you figured out, what you built here, is going to be the difference between whether some of these families make it through winter. The Pellmans, maybe the Grubers, depending on their east field. And he exhaled. I owe you more than an apology. I know that, but it's what I have right now. Martha looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the fence post outside Dunmore's barn. She thought about the laughter at the grain store that day. Not just Grimes, but the men standing with him, and the women who had looked at their shoes. She thought about every time in 2 years she'd walked into a room in this settlement and felt the assessment happening before she'd opened her mouth, the slow cataloging that arrived at its conclusion before she'd said a word. She thought about what it would feel like to say all of that to Hector Grimes's face. She thought about how long she'd been carrying it, and then she thought about 197 birds. About a cornfield still standing in a section that had been stripped bare on every side. About a piece of paper with a grid on it that bore almost no resemblance to what she'd actually done, because what she'd actually done had been built from failure and adjustment and stubbornness and $18 and a bad knee and cut hands and not stopping. Tell me about your east field, she said. How many acres? He blinked. Martha, I'm going to write a guide, she said, for the Agricultural Council. Technical description of the methods. If you want to understand what I did well enough to do it yourself, you should read it. But I can also walk you through the basics now, if you want. He looked at her for a long moment. She met the look without moving. Yeah, he said finally. His voice came out different from usual, smaller maybe. More like what a person actually sounds like when the performance is down. Yeah, I'd like that. She opened the gate. He came through. She walked him through it the same way she'd walked Emmett Gruber through it, and Eleanor Voss, and Adeline Foss. The same sequence, the same technical explanation, the same showing of the wire runners and the willow lashings and the gravity feed pipe. Grimes asked different questions than any of the others had, more focused on the labor, on the physical logistics of managing the pens with 2 people, on whether it was possible to scale the operation to cover 40 or 50 acres rather than the 20-some she'd worked. She answered everything he asked. At one point, he crouched to look at the wire runner design, the same way Emmett Gruber had, the same crouch, the same long look, and he said, "This is simple." "Yes," Martha said. "I mean, it's so simple I could have built it myself." "You could have," Martha said. He looked up at her from his crouch. The expression on his face had several things in it simultaneously, and she didn't try to sort them out. He stood up. "What did the birds cost?" $15 for 342, from Dunmore. Dunmore. He nodded, processing. He's got capacity for that number? He had the capacity in July. Whether he will next season depends on his spring hatch. If he doesn't, then someone will need to breed the stock themselves, Martha said. The birds I've got, the survivors, are good birds. They're proven. Anyone who starts their flock from my laying stock next spring is starting with birds that have demonstrated they can work a field under swarm conditions. She paused. That has value. Hector Grimes looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not the slow assessment she was used to from him, but something faster, more like recognition. He was a businessman for all his other qualities, and he understood when a value had been clearly stated. I'd like to put in an order, he said, for spring chicks from your laying stock, whatever you can supply. Martha looked at him for a moment. I'll add you to the list, she said. There was a list now. She'd started it 2 days after the swarm, the evening Eleanor Voss had left, when she'd taken out a fresh piece of paper and written down 4 names, including Emmett Gruber and a man named Tolliver from the South section, who'd sent his son on horseback with a message asking if she'd sell chicks in spring. She'd added to it since then. Hector Grimes' name went at the bottom of a list that now had 9 entries, representing somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,500 chicks, if all the orders held, which was more chicks than her current flock could produce in a single season and would require a decision about breeding stock and expansion that she and Caleb hadn't finished discussing yet. She walked Grimes back to the gate. He went through it, and then he stopped on the roadside and turned back. The South Corn, he said, your South section. 15 to 18%, she said, gone. You're going to be short on winter stores. We'll manage. I was quiet for a moment. Then, I've got surplus from my north barn. Last year's corn stored dry. I've been meaning to turn it anyway before the new harvest. He paused. I could let you have it at cost. You'd be doing me a favor taking the storage space. Martha looked at him. She understood what this was. Not charity. He was too proud for charity, and so was she. But a transaction arranged to provide dignity for both sides, which was its own kind of intelligence. What's your cost? She said. He told her. It was fair, lower than fair actually, but framed as cost, so that neither of them had to call it what it was. I'll send Caleb on Saturday, she said. He nodded once, put his hat back on, walked to his wagon. She watched him go. Then she turned back to her fields. The afternoon brought 2 more families from farther sections, people she knew by name but not well, people who had heard what they'd heard and driven the distance to see it for themselves. She showed them the pens. She explained the system. She answered the questions and didn't editorialize and didn't make it sound like anything other than what it was, which was a thing she'd built from available materials under significant pressure with a lot of failures along the way and an outcome that was better than it might have been and worse than it might have been and was what it was. By the time the last wagon left, Rose was asleep and Caleb had started supper, and the sun was angling the long prairie shadows eastward in a way that turned the standing corn rows gold and the dry grass at the field edges a deeper amber, and Martha stood at the edge of the east field for a few minutes in that light just being there. She was tired. She'd been tired for 3 weeks, and the tiredness had become a kind of climate, a condition she operated in rather than a state she was waiting to leave. Her knee ached with the specific persistence of something that needed attention. She hadn't given it. Her hands still had the wire cuts, most of them healed over now, but a few still finding ways to reopen when she used them wrong, which was constantly. She thought about Adeline Foss's notebook, about the names on her spring chick list, about Emmett Gruber's careful sketch, and Eleanor Voss's independent diagram, and Hector Grimes standing at her fence with his hat on straight and his face doing something she hadn't seen it do before. She thought about the word survivable, which had been the word she'd used the night after the swarm, the word she'd held up against the damage, and the count, and the list of what remained, and how it had seemed like enough then because it was enough then. Just enough. And just was its own kind of gift in a territory that didn't distribute gifts carelessly. She put her hand on a corn stalk at the edge of the east field. The stalk was solid, the ear developing in the husk the way it was supposed to, the silk brown and dry at the tips the way it was supposed to be at this stage of the season. A normal cornstalk doing what cornstalks do. Standing in a field that had reason to be standing, she held it for a moment. Then she let it go. Supper was waiting. Rose would be up again in an hour. There was a technical document to write for an agricultural council, and a breeding plan to finalize with Caleb, and a list of 9 names that was going to require decisions she hadn't made yet. Tomorrow, the pens would need to move again, and the water levels checked and the morning count done with the specific care she gave the morning count every day, the only way she knew to keep track of what she had. She went inside. Caleb looked at her face when she came in the way he always did. The specific diagnostic look of a man who had learned her well enough to get useful information that way. "Good day," he said. Martha considered the question with the honesty she applied to most things. The south corn was still gone. The knee still needed looking at. The list had 9 names on it, and the math on the breeding stock hadn't been done yet. "Yeah," she said. "It was a good day." He handed her a plate, and she sat down. And outside the prairie evening settled into its long, clear blue, and the 197 birds in the field made their quiet end-of-day sounds. And the corn that was standing stood in the cooling air, and the list on the table had 9 names on it, and that was where they were, which was a different place from where they'd been. And the distance between those 2 places had been built one day at a time from things that were available, which was the only way any distance worth having ever gets built. The technical document for Adeline Foss took Martha 11 days to write, not because the content was complicated. She knew the content, she'd lived it. It was in her hands and her knee and the wire-cut scars that were fading now to thin, pale lines across her palms. It was complicated because writing it down required making decisions about what mattered and what didn't, and every time she thought she'd found the right level of detail, she'd read it back and find either a gap that would lose a person with no prior experience, or an over-explanation that would lose a person who was practical and impatient, which most farmers were. She wrote it 4 times. The 4th version she sent with a writer to the territorial council office in the county seat, and she kept the 3rd version, which she thought was actually slightly better but had a coffee stain on the 2nd page that she hadn't wanted to explain. Caleb read all 4 versions. He made 2 corrections to the technical specifications, the pipe diameter measurement she'd gotten slightly wrong, and a description of the wire runner angle that was ambiguous enough to be misread. She corrected both and did not say anything about having made the errors, and he did not say anything about having found them, which was how they handled most things, and which worked well enough. The 9 names on the spring chick list became 12 by the end of August. The 12th name was Clara Pellman, who came to the fence on a Tuesday morning with her youngest child on her hip, and her face doing the careful, neutral thing that Martha recognized as a person who has rehearsed a conversation several times before having it and is still not sure they got it right. Clara was younger than Martha had thought, maybe 20, maybe not quite, with the kind of tiredness in her eyes that didn't come from a single bad season, but from several in a row, stacked and compounding. She stood at the fence and looked at the fields, and then at Martha and said, "I don't have money for the spring order." Martha waited. "But I have labor," Clara said, "and my husband has labor, and we'd work for the stock, if that's something you'd consider." Martha looked at her. She thought about the morning she'd stood at Dunmore's counter with $15, and the specific feeling of being the person doing the asking rather than the person being asked, the feeling of needing something from someone, and not knowing whether the someone was going to find a way to make the transaction dignified or not. "Come inside," Martha said. "Let's talk about what that looks like." They worked out an arrangement over coffee that took 40 minutes and required 2 pieces of paper and a minor disagreement about the value of a day's skilled pen-building labor versus a day's unskilled field labor, which Clara turned out to have clear opinions about. She was not, Martha discovered, the quiet acquaintance from the grain store nods. She was a woman with a dry, specific humor and a practical intelligence that she apparently kept folded up in her pocket in public and only took out when she trusted the room. By the end of the 40 minutes, Martha had made a note about the Pellman arrangement in the margin of the breeding plan she'd been drafting with Caleb, and Clara Pellman had a place on the spring list. At the door, Clara stopped. "I didn't laugh," she said. "At the grain store. I want you to know." "I know you didn't," Martha said. "I didn't say anything either." "I know that too." Clara looked at her. "I should have." Martha held the door. "Next time," she said. Clara nodded once and left with her child, and Martha stood in the doorway and watched the wagon go and thought that next time was as honest a commitment as most people managed, and sometimes it was enough. The breeding plan she and Caleb had been drafting required decisions that got harder the more clearly they understood what they were deciding. The question was not simply how many chicks they could supply in spring. It was what kind of operation they were building and what scale made sense and what the constraints were, which were several and interrelated and did not resolve themselves neatly into a single answer. The 197 surviving birds were entering laying age on a rolling schedule, the earliest developers beginning to lay in September, the later ones following through October and into November. By mid-September, Martha was collecting between 40 and 60 eggs a day, a number that was still short of the full flock's eventual capacity, but was already enough to understand the scale of what was coming. She kept a count on the wall above the table in chalk, updating it each evening. Caleb watched the number grow without saying much about it, but she caught him looking at it sometimes in the way a person looks at a thing they are still in the process of believing. The Willard account came due in October, as agreed. Martha delivered the first payment in person, 24 of her best layers' eggs, selected carefully, packed in straw, in the wooden case she'd built for transport. And Willard examined them with the manner of a man who had agreed to a transaction and was now discovering whether he'd agreed to a good one. He turned one egg in his hand, held it to the light, looked at the shell quality. "These are good eggs," he said. "I know they are," Martha said. He looked at her over the egg. Something in his face shifted slightly, a recalibration of a small kind. "I'll need the same quality through the winter." "You'll get what the hens produce," she said. "The quality's consistent. I've been tracking it." He put the egg back in the case. "I may want to expand the arrangement in spring," he said, "if you have the capacity." "Add yourself to the list," Martha said. "I'll let you know about capacity when I know about capacity." He wrote his name in the ledger on his side, and she wrote it at the bottom of hers. And the Willard account became something different from a debt being serviced. It became a supplier relationship, which was a different thing in kind, and the difference mattered in ways that were practical and also not entirely practical. She wrote the Willard note in the breeding plan when she got home. The plan was getting dense with notes, the margins filling with contingencies and cross-references, and the particular kind of writing that happens when a person is thinking on paper and hasn't decided yet which thoughts are decisions and which are still questions. Caleb had contributed 2 pages to it in his small, careful hand, numbers mostly, projections on feed costs and space requirements, and the labor equation for managing an expanded flock alongside the field crops. The pages were clipped together with a piece of bent wire. She'd taken it off a pen frame, out of habit, the way she took wire from everything now, because wire had become the material she thought with. The letter from the Territorial Agricultural Council came in the second week of October. It was addressed to Mrs. Martha Mercer, and it was written on council stationery in a formal hand that Martha read twice, not because it was unclear, but because the first reading felt like something she needed to verify. Adeline Foss had submitted the technical document to the council's quarterly review, and the council had voted to include it in their winter distribution to territorial farm operators, a distribution that went to somewhere in the range of 400 families across the section. The letter asked Martha's permission for the inclusion and offered in the final paragraph a modest payment for the use of the document. The payment was $12. Martha sat at the table with the letter for a long time. $12 was not the $18 they'd spent on the chicks. But it was the kind of number that sat beside that number and made a kind of statement, and the statement was quiet, but it was clear. She showed the letter to Caleb that evening. He read it twice the same way she had, and then he set it on the table and looked at it without picking it up again. $12, he said, for a document I wrote in the evenings over 11 days. Plus the third version with the coffee stain. Martha looked at him. I'm writing back to accept. Obviously, he said. She wrote back that night, a brief letter accepting the terms and granting permission, and she added a line at the bottom offering to answer questions from farm operators who read the guide and had specific implementation problems, which she had not planned to add, but which came out of the pen before she'd decided to write it. She looked at it after she'd written it. Let it stand. It was true, and it was practical, and it was the kind of offer that made sense to make. The letter went out with the next mail rider. Responses started arriving in November, with the cold. The cold came to the Dakota Territory the way it always did, without significant warning and without the courtesy of a gradual transition, just a morning where the quality of the air was different, and the temperature had moved to a place it intended to stay for several months. Martha had been preparing for it since September, the expanded winter shelter for the flock being the primary project. A structure built against the south wall of the barn, enclosed on 3 sides and roofed with the canvas from the wagon cover and additional material she'd traded 24 eggs for with a family. 2 settlements north who had canvas to spare and a preference for eggs over cash in that particular season. The shelter was not elegant. The roof had a low point on the east side that needed propping with a stick and heavy snow, or it would sag and eventually collapse. And she knew this from having watched it happen once in the first week, and having fixed it with a stick, and the kind of calm that comes from having fixed worse things. The floor was packed dirt, with a layer of old straw she replenished every 2 weeks. The water situation in freezing temperatures was a new problem she solved with a buried clay pot and a candle lantern that kept the water just above freezing overnight, which was a solution she was not confident about and checked every morning and which worked often enough to count as working. 197 birds going into winter was not a number she'd planned for. She'd planned for fewer losses during the swarm and more losses before it, and the actual number sat between those 2 expectations in a way that required adjustment. She adjusted. She'd been adjusting for 5 months, and she was reasonably good at it by now. The first letter from a farm operator came from a man named Bertrand Culp, who farmed 80 acres in a section 40 miles northwest, and who had read the council guide and had questions about the water system that were specific and intelligent and showed he'd understood the document and was now trying to apply it to conditions slightly different from the ones she'd written for. His soil drained differently. His creek access was seasonal rather than year-round. He had more acreage than she'd covered and was trying to understand how to scale the pen coverage accordingly. She wrote back 4 pages. She answered every question he'd asked, and 3 he'd implied and 1 he hadn't thought to ask yet, but would. And she sent it with the return rider and thought no more about it until his response arrived 2 weeks later with 6 more questions and a note at the bottom saying, her letter had been passed around to 3 other operators in his section, and could she address the scaling question more specifically because they were all wondering about it. She addressed the scaling question more specifically. In doing so, she found she'd been imprecise in the original document about the relationship between acreage and flock size under different nymph density conditions, and she wrote a correction that was 3 paragraphs and sent it to Bertrand Culp, and also to Adeline Foss at the council, who wrote back 10 days later saying the correction would be included in the spring update of the guide. The correspondence expanded through November and into December. Not dramatically. She was not running a school or an office. She was running a farm in winter with a toddler and a flock and a breeding plan that still had unresolved questions in it. But consistently, 2 or 3 letters a week arriving and 2 or 3 going out. A slow-moving conversation with people she'd never met about problems she understood and could help with. She managed it in the evenings mostly, at the table by the lamp, Rose asleep, Caleb reading or mending or sitting quiet, the way he sat sometimes when he was content, and didn't need anything from the silence except for it to continue. One evening in December, he looked up from the harness he was mending and said, "How many letters this week?" 4 in, 3 out, Martha said without looking up from the one she was writing. "You're running short on paper." "I know. I'm going to Willard's Thursday." "Add it to the Willard account?" "No," she said. "I'll pay for paper." He was quiet for a moment, then, "The $12. "Part of it," she said. She heard him go back to the harness. The lamp made its small, steady sound. Outside, the prairie winter was doing what prairie winters do, which is be absolute and committed and not particularly interested in what it costs the things living in it. In January, something happened that Martha had not put on any list or in any plan. A man named Harlan Deere arrived at the property on a Wednesday with no prior communication, having ridden 2 days from a settlement in the eastern section, and he introduced himself at the door as a purchaser for a commercial poultry supply operation based out of the territory capital. He was perhaps 50, with the manner of a man who conducted transactions for a living and had developed a style that was professional without being warm, efficient without being rude. He sat at the table and he explained his company's interests clearly and without padding. They supplied farm stock throughout the territory. They had become aware of the Mercer flock through the council guide and the subsequent correspondence, and they were interested in a breeding stock contract for the following 3 years. The terms he put on the table were better than anything Martha had imagined when she'd added the council letter to her files. He wanted exclusivity on a portion of the spring hatch, not all of it, a specific percentage, in exchange for a deposit paid now, before the hatch, which was the part of the arrangement that Martha had not expected, and which sat on the table between them like something that needed to be looked at carefully from several angles. "The deposit," she said, "before the hatch." "Before the hatch," Harlan Deer confirmed. "We're not in the business of paying for promises, but we're also not in the business of waiting until spring to secure stock. We already know the quality of. The deposit secures our position." Martha looked at the figure he'd written on the paper he'd pushed across the table. It was a real number. It was a number that resolved several of the open questions in the breeding plan and created some new ones, but the new ones were problems of a different order from the old ones. The old ones had been about survival. The new ones were about scale. "I'll need to discuss it with my husband," she said. "Of course," Deer said. He didn't move. "I mean, I'll need to discuss it tonight and give you an answer tomorrow," Martha said. He did move then, a slight adjustment in his posture, recalibrating. "I can stay in the settlement tonight," he said. "Willard at the hardware store has a room," Martha said. "He charges fare." Deer left and Martha and Caleb sat at the table with the paper in front of them and did not speak for approximately the first 2 minutes, which was its own kind of communication. Then Caleb said, "The exclusivity clause. It's on a percentage, not the full hatch. 30%. 30% of the spring hatch," Martha said, "which leaves us 70 to fill the private list. The list is at 12 names. Was it 12? I got 2 more letters this week. It's 14. Caleb looked at the paper, then at the chalk count on the wall. 91 eggs for the day, the flock not yet at full laying capacity but close, the number still going up on the rolling schedule of birds entering their first production cycle. 14 orders and a 30% commercial commitment," he said slowly. "We'd need more birds. We'd need to expand the breeding stock," Martha said, "which is why he's offering the deposit. He knows we need the capital to scale for what he's asking." "It's a good deal," Caleb said. "It's a very good deal," Martha said, "which means we need to understand what it costs us." They talked until 11 o'clock, which was later than either of them usually managed in winter when the cold made sleep necessary earlier. They went through the breeding plan margins and the feed cost projections and the labor equation and the space requirements and what expansion meant for the field operation in spring, because the field operation still had to happen. The chicks were not instead of farming, they had always been alongside it, the two things interdependent in a way the breeding plan needed to reflect. At 11 o'clock, Caleb said, "Take the deposit. Negotiate the exclusivity down to 25%. Martha looked at him. "You think he'll take 25, Sham?" "I think he came 2 days on horseback in January. He'll take 25. She thought about it. 25%, she said, testing it. "You've got something he can't get anywhere else in the territory," Caleb said. "That's not arrogance, that's inventory." Martha almost smiled. "When did you start talking like a merchant?" "About the time my wife started writing letters to 40 farmers a week," he said. She negotiated 25% the next morning. Harlan Deer considered it for a moment, asked one counter question about delivery timing that Martha answered satisfactorily, and accepted. He paid the deposit in bank draft, which Martha took to the settlement's nearest banking agent 2 days later, with the specific feeling of a person doing a thing they have been working toward for long enough that the doing of it has a different quality from ordinary transactions. The bank draft went partly into the breeding expansion, 3 additional breeding pairs purchased from a farm 40 miles south, whose stock Martha had researched through the correspondence network she'd built over winter, and partly into the South Corn Gap, the stores they'd been short since the swarm and had been managing through Grimes's corn and careful rationing and the egg income. The gap closed in February, not dramatically, not with anything left over, but closed, which meant what it meant. Spring came the way springs come to the Dakota Territory, reluctantly, in increments, with several false starts that convinced you it had arrived before pulling back into cold and making you wait another 2 weeks. Martha had learned not to trust the first warm days, had learned to read the specific signs that meant the warmth was real and committed rather than provisional, and she waited for those signs before she started the main hatch preparation. Rose was walking steadily by then, 27 months old and deeply invested in the chickens, which she referred to collectively as box, in a way that Martha understood and Caleb pretended not to find funny. She followed Martha on the morning rounds with the seriousness of a child who has decided that something is important and has appointed herself to its management, and Martha let her come, explaining things in the plain language she'd learned to use from writing the council guide, the language that described things as they were, without dressing them up. "This one's going to lay today," Martha told her one March morning at the third nest box. Rose looked at the hen with great seriousness. "Bok?" she said. "That's right," Martha said. "She's ready." Rose thought about this. Then she reached out with one careful finger and touched the hen's feathers, and the hen tolerated it with the particular long-suffering patience of a bird that had become accustomed to the small person. Clara Pellman came in March with her husband, a quiet man named Dirk, who turned out to be an excellent carpenter, and who looked at the pen design with the eye of someone who saw immediately how to improve it, and in a credit to his character, asked Martha's permission before suggesting anything. She gave the permission and listened to the suggestions, two of which she used and one of which she set aside for later consideration, and by the end of the day they had built 3 new pen frames together that were measurably better than anything Martha had built alone, lighter and more precisely jointed, the runners fitted with a consistency that her improvised originals had never quite achieved. She looked at the 3 new frames and thought about the first pen she'd built on the first morning, the thing she'd put together from wagon boards and bent wire in an hour, because the situation required it, the ugly functional thing that had done the work it needed to do without being right in any aesthetic sense. These were better. That was allowed. Things were allowed to get better. The spring hatch was larger than she'd managed on her own before, which was expected, and messier than she'd expected, which was also expected, and the mortality in the first week was lower than her first cohort's mortality had been, which she attributed to better housing and the breeding stock she'd brought in from the southern farm, and the plain fact that she knew more now than she had in July, which was also allowed. She counted the hatch on the 4th day, the day the reliable survivors were distinguishable from the ones that weren't going to make it. And the number was better than she'd projected in the conservative version of the breeding plan, and slightly short of the optimistic version, which was approximately where she'd expected to land and which meant the plan had been honest, which was its own form of satisfaction. The 14 private list orders went out in April, hand-delivered by Caleb to most of the closer farms and sent by arrangement with 2 settlement riders to the farther ones. The Harlan deer commitment went out in late April, the 25% in 2 batches a week apart, packed in the ventilated crates she'd built over winter with Dirk Pellman's joinery improvements. Deer sent a brief note with the payment for the first batch saying the birds had arrived in good condition, which was not effusive but was from a man Martha had understood to be constitutionally incapable of effusiveness, and she took it as the professional confirmation it was meant to be. Emmett Gruber put in his new chicks in May with his son's help, and Martha rode out to walk his east field with him on the 3rd day, and look at the pen positioning and tell him 2 adjustments she thought would improve the coverage. He made the adjustments without argument, which was a thing she hadn't been certain of, but which turned out to be how Emmett Gruber operated once he'd decided something was worth listening to. His east field had a nymph hatch in June that was modest compared to the previous year but present, and the birds worked it in the manner that birds work things when they've been properly positioned and are old enough for the job, which is to say, efficiently and without drama. Hector Grimes put in his chicks in May as well, a larger order than anyone else on the private list, and he built his own pen system from the council guide rather than asking Martha to supervise, which she respected. His pens were not as refined as the Pellman improved frames, but they were solid and functional, which was the right category for a first attempt. He sent a note in June saying the east section was showing good results. The note was brief and factual and signed with his full name, and Martha pinned it to the wall above the table where she kept the other correspondence. She did not pin it there to look at it. She pinned it there because it was a piece of her farm's business, and her farm's business deserved to be organized, which was the reason she told herself, and mostly she believed it. By midsummer, the Mercer operation had a shape that Martha had not drawn on any piece of paper, had not planned in the specific form it had taken, because the specific form it had taken was the product of a year of adjustment to conditions as they actually were, rather than as she'd expected them to be. The field crops and the poultry operation ran alongside each other in the interdependent way she'd always understood they would. The chickens' field work reducing the pest pressure on the crops providing the security that let her maintain the flock through the seasons when egg income alone wouldn't have covered costs. The breeding side and the commercial arrangement with deer provided income of a different kind, more stable than harvest income, spread differently through the year. It was not a simple operation. It was not the sod house and the tobacco tin and the single question of whether this season's planting would yield enough to get through winter. It was more complicated than that, with more moving parts and more decisions and more correspondence and more accounting, and some mornings when she sat down at the table before dawn to look at the day's list, Martha felt the weight of the complexity in a way that was not quite what she'd expected when she'd crouched in the dirt of the lower field and felt the grasshoppers moving under her hand. Some mornings she felt it and thought about how much easier certain things had been when the only question was survival, and survival was a clean binary thing. Either you made it or you didn't. Those mornings she got up and went outside and did the work, which was the answer to most things she'd found. Not because the work resolved the question, but because it gave the question a productive context to live in. One evening in late summer, Caleb came in from the east field and sat down at the table and looked at the chalk count on the wall. The tally of the day's eggs, higher now than it had ever been. A number that still struck her sometimes as belonging to someone else's life. And he said quietly, with the particular tone that meant he'd been thinking about something for a while before saying it, "Do you remember what Grimes said at the grain store?" Martha looked up from the letter she was writing. "I remember everything about that day." "He called it dinner," Caleb said. 342 dinners. "I remember." He was quiet for a moment. "You know what I think about when I look at that number on the wall?" "What?" "I think about the fact that you were right when everyone said you were wrong. And you were right not because you were smarter or luckier or any particular thing that can't be learned from. You were right because you were paying attention to what was actually in front of you, and everyone else was paying attention to what was supposed to be in front of them." He looked at her. "That's the thing I think about." Martha held his gaze. Outside, the late summer evening was doing the thing it did this time of year, the long, slow gold that held the prairie in suspension for the hour before dark. Everything lit from the side, shadows long and unhurried. The flock in the east field made its quiet end-of-day sounds. Rose was asleep already, worn out from an afternoon of serious supervisory work among the nest boxes. "The $18, Martha said. "What about it? If I'd known then what it was going to turn into—" "You still would have spent it on the chicks," Caleb said. She thought about that. About the tobacco tin. About standing at Dunmore's counter with the money in her hand and the specific feeling of that moment. The fear underneath the decision that she'd kept in a separate room and not let herself open. She thought about what it had felt like to believe something when no one else believed it. To carry the weight of a conviction that you couldn't fully prove yet and had to act on anyway. And about how that weight doesn't go away when you're right. It just becomes a different kind of weight, the kind that's built into you rather than resting on you from outside. "I would have been more afraid," she said. "You were already afraid." "More, though." Caleb nodded. "Yeah," he said, "probably." He got up and went to the stove, and she went back to the letter, and the lamp made its small, steady sound. And the day's count on the wall was the day's count. And the letter she was finishing was to a woman named Ruth Acker, who farmed in the northern section, and had written 3 weeks ago with questions about winter water management for a large flock, and had included, almost as an afterthought in the final paragraph, that she was glad someone had figured out how to put this in writing because she'd been trying to manage her chickens through infestations for 4 years without anyone to ask and hadn't known such a thing was possible. Martha finished the letter. She sealed it. She put Ruth Acker's name on the outside in the careful hand she'd learned from the teacher who believed handwriting was a form of thinking. Then she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table, and she thought about what Caleb had said, about paying attention to what was actually in front of you. And about the year that had passed between the morning she'd crouched in the lower field and this evening, and about everything that had happened in between, the losses and the adjustments and the letters and the lists and the things she'd figured out by failing at them first, and about the 197 birds that had become something larger, and about the South corn that was still gone, in memory at least, the permanent reminder that the thing that worked had cost something and the something mattered. She thought about what it means to trust your own judgment when everyone else is laughing, not to be right. That was different and smaller and less important than it sounded. Being right was the result, not the thing itself. The thing itself was the decision made before you knew whether you were right. The moment you put your hand on what you know and say, "This is what I know, and I'm going to act on it, even though I can't prove it yet, and even though everyone else sees something different." That moment. The one in the dust, before anything had happened, before anyone knew how it was going to go. That moment was the thing. and it was available to anyone who was paying attention and willing to hold the weight of it until the outcome arrived to tell you what you'd done. Martha picked up the letter. She put it with the others going out on the morning rider. She blew out the lamp and sat in the dark for a moment, the way she'd sat the very first night, after the chicks were settled in the temporary pen, and Rose was asleep, and Caleb had gone to bed, and the plan was still just marks on paper. The dark had the same quality. The prairie quiet was the same quiet. The difference was in what the dark held now, not just the plan and the fear and the 342 small lives in a borrowed pen, but the whole accumulated weight of what those lives had become and what she'd built around them, and what the building had cost, and what it had made. She sat with all of that for a moment. Then she went to bed. Outside, the stars came out one at a time, and then all at once, the way they do over flat country where there's nothing between you and the full width of the sky. And the east field held its birds, and the pen frames with their bent wire runners and willow lashings sat in the moonlight, and the standing corn made no sound in the still air, and the whole quiet operation rested in the dark, in the way that things rest at the end of a day that was what it was supposed to be. Not perfect, not without cost, not without the South Corn's ghost sitting in the inventory records and the memory of 63 dead chicks on the third morning and the wire cuts on her palms, and the knee that would ache in cold weather for the rest of her life as a specific and permanent record of what had been required. But standing, built from available materials, built from attention and stubbornness and $18 and the willingness to hold a conviction alone until it became something the world could see. Standing. That was the thing about what Martha Mercer built in the summer of 1887 in the Dakota Territory. It wasn't just a flock, and it wasn't just a farm, and it wasn't even just a method for surviving what the prairie decided to throw at the people who'd chosen to live on it. It was the demonstration, quiet, partial, imperfect, and absolutely real, that the laughter of people who've already made up their minds about you is not the same thing as being wrong, and that the distance between those two things is where everything worth building actually gets built.